Amid Iceland's jagged coastlines and windswept islands, secrets linger where the land meets the restless sea, and even the most familiar waters conceal stories that resist explanation. Across isolated shores and hidden coves, fishermen disappear without a trace, lights flicker where no vessel sails, and echoes drift from cliffs that have witnessed centuries of human passage. As you step into these landscapes, the air carries the scent of salt and volcanic ash, and the rhythm of the waves seems to whisper warnings long ignored. From the silent cliffs of Flatey to the shadowed caves of Vik, each expedition traces the inexplicable recording phenomena that defy understanding yet leave traces small and haunting. In this journey, you will encounter Icelandic mysteries that remain unsolved, anomalies that blur the line between the natural and the unknown, inviting both scrutiny and awe. The cave locals refuse to enter after sunset. The slopes above Seyðisfjörður hold a quiet stillness in the evenings, a kind of muted presence shaped by the surrounding mountains and the narrow curve of the fjord below. Among the many natural hollows scattered through this part of East Iceland, one small cave stands apart, a shallow but sharply angled opening carved by centuries of meltwater and shifting rock. The place has no official name on maps and is not marked as a natural attraction, yet it remains the centre of a persistent local belief that no one should enter it after sunset, a belief that has survived through gradual modernisation and changing generations. Descriptions of the cave's atmosphere are surprisingly consistent, even from people who view it with scepticism. The entrance sits partly hidden behind uneven shelves of rock, creating the impression of a mouth recessed from the hillside. Inside, the floor narrows into a low corridor of dark stone, and the limited space forces anyone entering to move slowly and carefully. The air tends to feel colder than the outside temperature, even on summer evenings when the fjord is uncharacteristically warm, and this noticeable drop has been mentioned often enough that it forms one of the few measurable features people agree upon. Local hesitation surrounding the cave is rooted less in dramatic events and more in the accumulation of small, unsettling experiences that have been quietly retold over decades. Elders in Seyðisfjörður often explain that the cave has never been considered cursed or dangerous in a traditional sense. Instead, the concern focuses on strange sounds reported after dark, accounts that mention rhythmic breathing or a slow, steady exhalation coming from deeper within the stone. These descriptions have persisted even as rerouted trails, improved lighting in the village, and increased tourism have changed the surrounding area. One recurring detail involves the way the cave appears to change after sunset, not through any visible alteration but in how it feels when one stands near the entrance. People familiar with the environment note that mountain winds in Iceland can create tonal vibrations as they pass through narrow spaces, yet the cave's position does not align with the usual wind channels descending toward the fjord. Hikers who approach in the evening have described a low pulse of sound, more muted than a gust but steady enough to suggest movement deeper inside. Geologists who have surveyed the broader region around Seyðisfjörður acknowledge that the mountainsides contain numerous fissures, concealed melt channels, and pockets of porous lava rock. However, none of these features has been linked directly to the cave, and no official study has focused on the structure specifically. The lack of formal analysis is partly due to its obscurity. The cave is small and not considered significant compared to the well-documented geological formations found throughout East Iceland. Those who have entered the cave at dusk describe an unusual change in ambient sound once the light drops outside. A few hikers have noted that their own footsteps seem to soften as they move inward, not because the ground becomes smoother but because the air seems to absorb the noise. Others have spoken about a faint vibration under their palms when touching the stone walls, a sensation subtle enough to question but distinct enough to recall. These reports rarely include anything dramatic or dangerous, yet they are almost always followed by an explanation of why the person decided not to continue deeper in. The cave's isolation contributes to its atmosphere, especially during the long winter months when daylight fades early and shadows gather quickly along the mountainside. The surrounding terrain offers few reference points once the sun dips low, and the fjord's narrow shape creates a natural funnel that amplifies some sounds while muting others. Under these conditions, subtle noises become more noticeable, which raises questions about how many of the reported sounds are natural byproducts of the environment. Yet even with these explanations, the accounts rarely read as exaggerated or theatrical. Instead, they align with the quiet, restrained descriptions typical of rural Icelandic communities, where stories about the land are often practical and rooted in observation. A small number of travellers have made attempts to disprove the beliefs, entering the cave at night with flashlights or recording equipment. Their experiences are usually uneventful, marked by cold air, occasional condensation on stone, and the difficulty of navigating tight spaces in limited light. What stands out is that even among the skeptics, a sense of discomfort tends to appear in their retellings, not enough to imply danger but enough to acknowledge the strangeness of the place. Others have noted brief moments where the temperature inside dropped several degrees without an obvious cause. Despite the ongoing curiosity from outsiders, residents of Seyðisfjörður rarely encourage nighttime visits, not from superstition but from a long-standing belief that the cave simply should not be entered after dark. The sentiment is not enforced by any rule or tradition, yet it is observed with quiet consistency. Some explain the caution as a matter of respect for the landscape, while others suggest that the cave acts differently at night for reasons still unknown. Whatever the rationale, the boundary remains firm, maintained through steady retelling rather than dramatic warning. The cave above Seyðisfjörður waits in the quiet hours after sunset, holding an unseen presence that has never shown itself, but has never been fully silent either. The unexplained hums beneath Hafnarfjörður. Evenings in Hafnarfjörður settle quietly over the town's lava-strewn footholds, yet the routine calm often carries a faint disturbance that many residents struggle to identify. In those quieter moments, the town's unique geology becomes more apparent, shaping the way noise travels across the old lava field. It is during these still hours that the phenomenon locals refer to as the unexplained hum beneath Hafnarfjörður finds its clearest expression, a low vibration that some hear as a tone and others feel only as a pressure in the air. Beneath the town lies the broad expanse of the light-around lava field, a layered terrain whose hidden channels complicate any effort to pinpoint the origin of unfamiliar sounds. Formed by an eruption over 2,000 years ago, the flow extends across the region in a series of compacted basalt structures that shift slowly over geological time. Researchers studying the area often note that the town's foundations interact with the landscape in ways that differ from more traditional bedrock settings, creating a natural echo chamber that amplifies subtle shifts below. Reports of a low, steady hum began appearing across separate neighbourhoods, each account describing a tone that surfaced after dark and lingered just long enough to leave listeners uneasy. The descriptions rarely matched in detail, with some residents mentioning a slight pulsing while others described a constant drone that bled into the background. Despite the differences, the shared pattern of nighttime emergence stood out, especially when several households began noting the phenomenon during long stretches of calm weather. Initial investigations focused on the machinery of daily life, but none of the harbour engines, power stations or geothermal systems matched the rhythm described in the complaints. Harbour operations were monitored during the hours when the hum was most often reported, and technicians confirmed that several large mechanisms remained inactive during those times. Electrical facilities underwent routine checks to observe any instability that might produce low-frequency vibration, yet nothing aligned with the pattern of the nighttime tones. What complicates the matter further is the way the hum rises only during certain weather conditions, creating a patchwork pattern that defies easy classification. On some nights, the air remains perfectly still and the sound becomes pronounced, while on others, with nearly identical atmospheric readings, the town falls into complete silence. The unpredictability of these intervals became one of the most challenging aspects, preventing investigators from conducting synchronized measurements across the town. Some specialists have suggested geological pressure pockets or shifting basalt veins, though these ideas remain tentative due to the absence of a measurable seismic trigger. Iceland's landscape experiences near constant microseismic activity, much of it too subtle for residents to notice, yet none of the monitored movement in Hafnarfjörður corresponded with the hum's appearance. Minor tremors typically produce abrupt momentary vibrations, while the hum described by residents often lasted minutes at a time. Without correlating seismic spikes or clear evidence of moving stone, the geological explanation remains speculative, even if it aligns with the region's broader volcanic history. Several households have noted faint tremors accompanying the sound, subtle enough to escape instruments yet distinct enough to unsettle anyone awake during the quietest hours. Some describe the sensation as a tiny shiver under the floorboards, while others recall a gentle resonance travelling up the legs of chairs or along window frames. These impressions are nearly impossible to quantify, but they persist across enough accounts to suggest a shared experience. The tremors never escalate, never shift toward anything dangerous, yet their presence gives weight to the idea that something beneath the town moves just enough to be felt but not measured. As midnight approaches, the surrounding noise of Hafnarfjörður fades, allowing the deep resonance to come forward with a clarity that makes the town's foundations feel unusually responsive. In these moments, the usual murmur of distant traffic, gusting wind and harbour activity dissolves, leaving a soundscape that amplifies whatever lies beneath. Residents who experience the hum describe the sensation of an environment briefly revealing a layer otherwise lost beneath daily life. Though fleeting, these episodes often linger in memory not for their volume but for the impression of something continuously present, yet rarely noticeable. Recordings made by curious residents reveal inconsistent frequencies, with some capturing a narrow vibration and others registering nothing at all despite standing only a short distance apart. The variation suggests that the hum may not be uniform across the town and could interact with the lava field's uneven surfaces in ways that distort how and where it travels. Even measurements taken on the same night show discrepancies that resist easy interpretation. Researchers note that low-frequency sounds often behave erratically in complex geological environments, yet the contrast here remains sharper than expected, especially given the town's relatively compact size. Among the town's population, reactions vary widely, ranging from resigned acceptance to a persistent worry that the hum suggests a deeper movement within the unseen layers below. Some residents view it as another quirk of living on volcanic ground, an expected consequence of the island's restless geology. Others, however, remain unsettled by the idea of a sound with no identifiable source, something neither mechanical nor fully natural in any recognised sense. Despite the lack of definitive explanations, the phenomenon continues to surface in conversations and local forums, leaving the community to wonder what, if anything, the hum might signify. Somewhere in the depths beneath Hafnarfjörður, a sound without an owner continues to rise into the night, steady enough to notice yet elusive enough to resist every attempt to follow it back to its source. The Breiðdalsvík time-slip account. A peculiar stillness drapes over Breiðdalsvík in the late afternoon, as if the mountains themselves hold back the march of time. The village, nestled at the mouth of the Breiðdalsá River and bordered by steep ridges of basalt, carries a quiet that is both ordinary and somehow suspended. For one visitor passing through the East Fjords, the experience of walking along the coastal road felt disorienting, as though minutes and hours blurred into each other. That fleeting distortion became known as the Breiðdalsvík time-slip, a subtle anomaly reported by few but enough to spark curiosity and quiet debate among those familiar with the region. Even without dramatic change, the air held a peculiar weight, a sense that ordinary chronology had been nudged, if only for a moment. The river valley narrows toward the coast, framed by basalt ridges that have observed centuries of wind and tide without interruption. These ridges, layered with volcanic rock and shaped by glaciers over millennia, form a natural corridor that funnels both sound and light in unusual ways. Visitors noted that as they walked, familiar markers seemed to stretch or compress, though nothing in the environment had changed. The observation highlights the tension between what is measurable and what is experienced, underscoring the mystery that draws attention to this otherwise quiet corner of Iceland. Along the waterfront, the quiet hum of activity seems to stretch, with fishermen noting that even familiar routines occasionally feel slowed or extended. Some villagers remarked that their watches, checked repeatedly, did not seem to align with their perception of elapsed time. The subtle dissonance left a lingering impression, not alarming but unmistakable. Though the accounts are careful to avoid exaggeration, they consistently describe the same sensation, a brief temporal irregularity that vanishes as quietly as it appeared. Residents recount the event sparingly, describing a moment when clocks appeared unmoored and the usual passage of hours felt uncertain. The visitor who reported it later detailed walking the length of the harbour road twice, only to find that daylight had barely shifted. Conversations with residents reveal a similar tone of cautious observation. They describe the moment as brief yet distinct, something that unsettled perception without leaving tangible evidence. The hesitation with which people discuss it underscores the subtlety of the phenomenon. Unlike earthquakes or storms, this anomaly left no marks on the land, no visible changes to verify its occurrence. Scientific surveys of the area reveal no topographical or magnetic irregularities sufficient to explain the experience. Researchers measured the local magnetic field, seismic activity, and even atmospheric pressure, all of which fell within expected ranges. There is no evidence of optical mirages, unusual air currents, or thermal layering that could produce the perception of slowed or accelerated time. Fog and reflective water often create subtle illusions along the coastline, yet they cannot account for the sense of time bending reported by witnesses. In certain conditions, low-lying mist stretches across the fjord, softening the horizon and blending the outlines of mountains and sea. Light refracted across wet surfaces can distort depth perception, yet those who experienced the slip noted that the illusion extended beyond mere visual confusion. The horizon remained constant, and landmarks appeared in their expected positions, leaving only the perception of temporal irregularity. Icelandic folklore contains scattered tales of temporal anomalies, though none precisely mirror the Breiðdalsvík account's circumstances. Legends of travellers briefly vanishing or arriving later than expected are documented in several regions, particularly in valleys and fjords where the terrain complicates orientation. While these tales do not provide a factual basis for the visitor's report, they illustrate a long-standing cultural recognition that the island's geography can affect perception. The resonance of such stories within the local consciousness may make reports like the Breiðdalsvík time slip easier to notice and remember. Evening light refracts differently in the narrow fjord, casting shadows that can disorient perception, yet this visual effect alone falls short of explaining the event. As the sun sinks behind distant mountains, long shadows stretch across water and land, subtly altering spatial relationships. Walkers may sense a slowing of movement or a stretching of time in these shifting patterns, yet the anomalies described in the Breiðdalsvík account occurred in moments when shadows and light aligned with ordinary expectations. The conditions suggest that perception of duration, not visual distortion, was central to the experience. The valley after dusk maintains a quiet that seems heavier than usual, a subtle pressure that amplifies the feeling of suspended hours. With fewer environmental cues, fading wind, muted wildlife, still waters, awareness of passing time becomes more acute. Witnesses describe an uncanny clarity of surroundings paired with an inability to measure duration, as though the mind recognizes change, but cannot situate it on a temporal scale. This heaviness is distinct from any physical sensation. It is a psychological impression of altered continuity, one that leaves observers unsure if it is the environment or their perception that has shifted. Memory itself seems fragile in this environment, as those who experience the phenomenon struggle to reconcile what was felt with what is measured. Retelling the account reveals gaps, approximations, and a persistent uncertainty that mirrors the elusive nature of the incident. Maps, logs, and photographs corroborate that nothing in the landscape altered during the reported slip, yet the psychological imprint remains vivid. The phenomenon appears to occupy the threshold between objective fact and subjective experience, a space where the ordinary flow of hours becomes indistinct and imperceptibly changed. The moment left no trace beyond the mind, lingering as a question that refuses to settle into the normal rhythm of day and night. The dark shape on Reynisfjara. A shadow moving against the relentless waves drew the attention of those walking along Reynisfjara, its form resisting identification with each glance. Witnesses recall the shape as ambiguous yet compelling, a dark presence that seemed both stationary and subtly shifting with the rhythm of the surf. For photographers trying to capture the scene, the object remained just beyond clarity, blending at times with wet stones or the froth of incoming tides. Locals describe passing through the area repeatedly, only to notice that the figure appeared at different points along the shore, as though it were tracing its own unpredictable path. The initial moments of observation carried an uneasy fascination. Here was something present yet ungraspable, forcing anyone who noticed it to question their perception without providing answers. Even from a distance, the human eye could not settle on the form's true size or shape, leaving a lingering impression that was difficult to dismiss. Photographers and hikers have occasionally paused mid-step, convinced that the figure held a deliberate awareness of being watched, yet it never approached or fled. Those present describe a sense that it reacted subtly to attention, as if movement and gaze affected its position or outline. Equipment such as cameras and binoculars revealed nothing definitive, yet even a peripheral view suggested a presence more substantial than mere driftwood or seaweed. Multiple witnesses over time report the same hesitations in perception, moments when their eyes seemed to follow movement that was not easily explained, where distance, light and motion converged into a haunting uncertainty. In these interactions, the shape achieves a paradoxical familiarity and unfamiliarity, like a shadow that knows it is being considered yet refuses to be comprehended. Observers describe the shape as both massive and indistinct, a presence that seems to alter its proportions depending on where it is viewed from. At certain angles, it appears low and elongated, stretched along the sand, while from other positions, it seems upright and imposing. This mutable quality frustrates efforts at measurement or documentation. The interplay of perspective, distance, and natural obstruction, rocks, tide pools, and uneven sand, complicates the ability to interpret the form with certainty. Some suggest the ocean itself distorts perception, yet even when the waves are calm, the figure retains an ambiguous presence. Its shifting proportions add to the tension between expectation and observation, creating a sense that human senses are ill-equipped to apprehend it fully. Attempts to explain the sighting through driftwood, bird flocks, or floating debris all fell short, leaving only an unsettling impression of intent and weight. While large logs occasionally wash ashore, their trajectory is predictable, and their form does not mimic the consistent, deliberate movement described by multiple witnesses. Flocks of seabirds or seals might occasionally produce fleeting shapes at the shoreline, yet these explanations fail to account for the figure's persistence and the sense of scale. Even subtle currents or foam patterns cannot replicate the impression of a singular cohesive presence. The failure of rational hypotheses amplifies the mystery, underscoring the fact that whatever was observed eluded standard categorization or natural explanation. The dark figure has appeared sporadically over months and years, sometimes during low tide, sometimes when the surf crashes high, never conforming to patterns expected by the human eye. Witness reports span different seasons, weather conditions, and lighting, yet the description remains remarkably consistent. People visiting the beach during sunrise, mid-afternoon, and dusk have all noted the figure's presence, though fleeting, confirming that it is neither an artifact of a single observer's imagination nor a momentary optical illusion. The irregularity of these appearances adds to the enigma, suggesting a phenomenon that resists predictability. Observers are left to reconcile the constancy of the reports with the inconsistency of the events themselves. Binoculars, cameras, and drones capture only blurred outlines or fleeting shadows, confirming that direct observation fails to fully resolve the phenomenon. Even high-resolution images fail to clarify whether the shape is animate, inanimate, or something else entirely. Videography attempts similarly yield frames in which details dissolve upon closer inspection, leaving only hints of contour and movement. The insufficiency of technological tools contributes to the narrative's eerie quality, highlighting the limits of human observation in a landscape already imbued with dramatic contrasts. Each failed recording leaves behind a mixture of anticipation and frustration, reinforcing the shape's elusiveness. Those who linger report a sense that the form is aware of their attention, moving subtly with the changing angle of vision, yet never materializing clearly. Visitors describe watching from different vantage points, observing the figure appear to shift just beyond the reach of binocular focus, as if it anticipates scrutiny. This awareness, whether real or a product of human perception, creates a tension between curiosity and caution. Some recount moments of hesitation, unsure whether to approach or retreat, and a subtle instinct emerges to respect the unseen boundary the shape seems to define. This perceived sentience elevates the phenomenon from a mere visual oddity to a psychological encounter that leaves a lasting impression. Legends of Reynisfjara and local folklore speak of trolls frozen in stone or mysterious figures emerging from the waves, echoing the uncanny sense of the dark shape. While these stories are centuries old, They provide context for the lingering unease visitors feel. Tales recount beings turning to stone at sunrise, restless shapes along the shore, and the sea as a source of illusion or warning. Though the shape on Reynisfjara cannot be directly linked to folklore, its presence resonates with long-standing cultural motifs of mysterious coastal forms and inexplicable sightings, lending a historical weight to the current reports. Even seasoned witnesses admit that memory and perception intertwine here, creating an impression of continuity that defies ordinary explanation. Observers often struggle to describe the figure afterward, finding that each retelling alters its perceived size, shape, or motion. Time and distance seem to blend with the act of watching, leaving impressions that are accurate in general outline but elusive in detail. The combination of fleeting visibility, mutable perception, and psychological tension makes the phenomenon resistant to scientific clarity, sustaining its reputation as one of Iceland's most enigmatic coastal mysteries. Though countless efforts have been made to capture or classify the Fara, it continues to elude comprehension, leaving observers with only fragmented recollections. The shape has been seen at different points along the beach, sometimes near the Reynisfjara sea stacks, other times along stretches of black sand far from obvious reference points. These observations consistently elude precise measurement or identification, and even when multiple witnesses are present, agreement on details is limited. The dark figure on Reynisfjara remains a mystery that defies conventional interpretation, persisting as a presence both real and elusive, tangible in its effect yet intangible in substance. Under the cloak of night, the figure lingers on the periphery of vision, a silent presence that seems determined never to disclose its true nature. The Húsavík beacon that never was. Witnesses from small fishing boats reported a steady beam of light emerging where no lighthouse had ever existed. For decades, Northern Fjord residents and sailors alike recounted seeing a bright, unwavering glow cutting across the dark waters of Húsavík, sometimes appearing suddenly in fog or heavy rain. Those who observed it described its consistency in both intensity and direction, remarking that it seemed as deliberate as any functioning navigational light. Curiously, the beam did not align with any existing maritime infrastructure or local harbour facilities, and yet the impressions it left were vivid enough that they could not be ignored. The initial reports, often taken individually, might have been dismissed as optical illusions or wishful thinking. But when similar accounts accumulated across multiple observers and over months, a pattern emerged that defied conventional explanation. Witnesses spoke not just of a passing gleam, but of a presence, reliable, fixed, and yet entirely untraceable. Sailors passing the northern harbour spoke of the glow cutting through fog, as if it were deliberately placed, holding its position with an unnatural steadiness that suggested design rather than coincidence. Those navigating in late autumn or early winter remarked on the clarity of the light despite thick mist, and the way it seemed to guide or mark a path in the water without any accompanying structure. Some recounted moments when the beam appeared at the exact location predicted by earlier sightings, as though independent observers were witnessing the same phantom source each time. The repetition of these reports across multiple vessels lent weight to their claims, suggesting a phenomenon that could not be wholly explained by weather, water, or imagination alone. The glow remained strikingly uniform in intensity, lacking the flicker or variation expected from campfires, lanterns, or transient reflections. Investigations along the coast revealed no structure, and official charts confirmed that nothing had ever been built in that location. Maritime records, harbour construction logs, and aerial surveys all failed to show evidence of a navigational aid in the area where the light reportedly appeared. Local authorities acknowledged the reports, but noted that there was no basis for installing a beacon in that section of the fjord. Even when experienced surveyors attempted to verify the source directly, they found nothing. No tower, no platform, no equipment capable of producing the observed luminosity. The absence of tangible evidence contrasted sharply with the consistency and clarity described by witnesses, creating an unsettling contradiction between human perception and documented reality. Experts noted that reflections on ice, water, or unusual atmospheric layers could sometimes create isolated shafts of light, offering a partial explanation for what observers saw. Conditions in Húsavík are occasionally ideal for superior mirages, where light bends over cold water surfaces or through temperature gradients in the air, producing images that appear stable and well-defined from certain vantage points. Likewise, patches of ice or reflective surfaces on small boats could redirect distant lights into the perception of a localized source. However, while these phenomena can create fleeting or distorted visual effects, they fail to account for the repeated directional consistency reported over months and across multiple witnesses. The anomaly persisted even when weather conditions were calm, lending further weight to the enigma. Recurring sightings continued over months, with independent observers describing the same phenomena under similar conditions. Fishermen in early morning hours, tourists venturing along the harbour, and sailors returning from offshore all recorded the appearance of a consistent, isolated beam. Even when observers were unfamiliar with previous reports, their descriptions matched those of prior witnesses in ways that seemed too precise to be coincidental. The repetition suggested a phenomenon that resisted the randomness of natural illusions while eluding any physical verification. In this way, the light assumed an almost mythic presence in the collective consciousness of the community, its existence acknowledged yet perpetually unconfirmed. Residents discussed the light cautiously, some connecting it to folklore, others attributing it to optical illusions or imagination. Stories circulated in the town about strange occurrences at sea, ranging from unexplained reflections to historical accounts of phantom lights in the North Atlantic. While residents did not claim that the beam was supernatural, they spoke of it with a degree of respect, acknowledging the difficulty of reconciling perception with documented absence. Conversations often drifted to the limitations of human sight and memory, suggesting that even in a small community accustomed to maritime challenges, some mysteries remain impervious to conventional explanation. Cameras and maritime logs consistently failed to capture the beam clearly, providing fleeting impressions without concrete evidence. Photographers attempting to document the phenomenon reported images that appeared blurred or incomplete, often showing only a vague glow that dissipated under scrutiny. Ship logs recorded entries describing lights, but no fixed coordinates could confirm the location or structure of a physical source. These repeated failures only heightened the sense of intrigue, reinforcing the paradox that something could be widely observed yet remain imperceptible to instruments designed to record such phenomena. Observers highlighted how low winter sun, mist, and the fjord's shape could distort perception, complicating identification of the source. The angle of light over the water, combined with fog, drifting snow, or shifting clouds, can create illusions of vertical or stationary light beams where none exist. Many noted that even brief glimpses could be convincing, with human cognition filling gaps and constructing a coherent impression of a functional beacon. Yet, while these conditions could contribute to misinterpretation, they did not entirely explain the repeated consistency across observers and days, leaving an enduring question mark over the reports. When compared with other North Atlantic coastal lights, similar anomalies appear occasionally, yet Húsavík's remained uniquely consistent in witness accounts. Phenomena such as Fata Morgana mirages, ice reflections, or distant ship lights have been documented elsewhere, occasionally fooling sailors and coastal residents. However, the Húsavík beam differed in its apparent steadiness, position, and recurrence. It created the impression of a permanent fixture, even though no physical structure could support such a conclusion. This divergence from expected behaviour only amplified the town's fascination and the wider interest of maritime observers and researchers alike. Each new sighting renewed interest, reinforcing the mystery without yielding any verifiable proof. The beam persisted as an enigma, noted in witness reports and local lore, yet absent from maps, charts, or technological recordings. Attempts to reproduce or explain it fell short, leaving only a consistent narrative of observation paired with impossibility. The more it was sought, the more elusive it remained, preserving its status as one of Iceland's most peculiar coastal mysteries. From the edge of the harbour, the phantom light endures in memory, brilliant yet impossible to place on any map. The drowned footsteps at Djúpalónssandur. The first set of footprints appeared near the tide line, pressed into black sand that should have erased any mark almost immediately. Local hikers and visitors had often noted the rapid erosion of tracks along Djúpalónssandur's jagged coastline, yet these impressions persisted long enough to be photographed and traced. The prints were neither random nor scattered. They suggested deliberate movement along the shore, extending from one rocky outcrop to another in a path that seemed humanly plausible but was unaccounted for by any witnesses. Early morning surveys sometimes revealed the same series of marks, even after storms had swept across the beach, and the persistence of these impressions defied the natural expectations of tidal erosion. For those who first stumbled upon the prints, the effect was profoundly unsettling, visible evidence of a presence that had left no observer, no sound, and no trace beyond the sand itself. Fishermen returning from morning excursions described the tracks as unusually deep and spaced in a way that suggested deliberate pacing. One local recounted stepping onto the beach just before sunrise and noticing impressions that led directly toward the remnants of a shipwreck iron and scattered stones along the shore. The depth of the marks indicated weight and pressure consistent with human passage, yet no one reported walking in the area. Other visitors noted the uniformity of the spacing and the clarity of the heels, suggesting not a frantic or accidental movement but a purposeful stride. Even those familiar with the beach's topography found the sequence of steps perplexing, as the footprints continued across stretches where waves or shifting sands should have obliterated them entirely. The paradox was clear. Something had passed here, but who or what remained a mystery. Djúpalónssandur's terrain is notoriously unforgiving, with shifting sands, hidden rock formations, and tides that can reclaim the shore within hours. The beach is framed by cliffs and littered with fragments of ships wrecked centuries ago, while black volcanic sand absorbs wind and water in ways that complicate tracking. Strong Atlantic currents can sweep debris far inland, leaving the shoreline both unpredictable and constantly in motion. In such conditions, any human footprint should be fleeting, disappearing almost as quickly as it is made. Yet the tracks in question resisted natural erasure, maintaining recognizable form and direction despite the challenging environment. For observers, this gave the impression of a shoreline that was selectively preserving evidence, as though the sand itself had a memory of an invisible passerby. Researchers and local authorities scoured the site after each report, yet no evidence of human passage could be confirmed. Survey teams documented the impressions, measuring their length, depth, and orientation, but they found no corroborating signs, no discarded clothing, tools, or footprints leading to or from the area. Weather records confirmed that no visitors had been in the vicinity during the reported times, and surveillance from nearby roads or settlement areas produced no sightings. Attempts to recreate the footprints under controlled conditions failed to replicate the exact shape and depth observed naturally on the shore. Every investigation reinforced the dissonance, a clear, consistent pattern of human-like movement paired with the absolute absence of human presence. Repeated observations noted that the footprints sometimes emerged overnight, only to partially vanish or appear in locations inconsistent with ordinary walking paths. Walkers reported seeing the prints extend across stretches of sand that had been swept clean by tides the previous day, and then suddenly fade into areas where rocky outcrops or shallow water should have blocked any normal traveller. In some instances, the prints appeared to traverse both wet and dry sand seamlessly, a feat that would be difficult even for experienced hikers. These anomalies suggested not just an unexplained arrival, but a manner of movement that contradicted natural expectations, leaving those who examined the site perplexed and cautious. Natural explanations were considered, from tidal currents and frost deformation to animal activity, but none accounted for the scale and directionality of the impressions. Crabs, seals, and other coastal fauna left marks on the sand, yet the observed footprints consistently exhibited the proportions and spacing of human feet. Frost heaving can create temporary impressions, but such markings are typically irregular and fragmented, unlike the carefully aligned tracks reported here. Even wave action, capable of depositing debris in strange configurations, failed to replicate the linearity and depth of these footprints. Each proposed explanation fell short, reinforcing the sense that the phenomenon could not be wholly reconciled with ordinary environmental processes. Stories of shipwrecked sailors, coastal spirits, and hidden Icelandic folk circulated among locals, adding layers of historical and cultural resonance to the mystery. While no one attributed the prints directly to myth, the area's history of maritime disaster and the enduring presence of legends about the hidden people, or Huldu folk, made the footprints feel almost portentous. Some townspeople recalled tales of ghostly apparitions retracing old paths along the shore, or of sailors appearing briefly before vanishing into the surf. Though these accounts were anecdotal, they reflected a cultural awareness of the uncanny possibilities along Iceland's coasts, lending a subtle context to otherwise inexplicable occurrences. Documenting the phenomenon proved difficult, as sudden fog, storm-driven waves, and constantly shifting sound erased or obscured the evidence before it could be properly analysed. Photographs taken hours apart sometimes showed the tracks clearly, while later images revealed only an impressionless beach. Meteorological conditions frequently interfered with attempts to study the site, leaving investigators with tantalising glimpses and incomplete records. Even careful observation failed to capture the full continuity of the markings, emphasising the ephemeral nature of the mystery and the challenge of recording something so fleeting yet so strikingly tangible. Comparable instances of inexplicable footprints have been recorded elsewhere in northern Iceland, yet Djúpalónssandur's marks remain uniquely persistent and puzzling. Other reports include tracks in frozen rivers, snowfields, or coastal sands that appear without origin, but few match the consistency and complexity observed here. In many ways, the beach has become a case study in the tension between natural processes and unexplained phenomena, where the physical environment and human expectation collide to produce questions without answers. This singularity continues to draw researchers, travellers, and the curious, each hoping to witness the mystery firsthand. Even seasoned observers concede that the shore refuses to yield a clear explanation, leaving the phenomenon as compelling as it is confounding. Footprints vanish with the tide and reappear under conditions that challenge both reason and prediction, suggesting forces at work that are partially understood, partially hidden, and entirely persistent. Those who have studied the marks find themselves returning again and again, aware that the evidence, however brief, is unmistakable and impossible to ignore. At low tide, the black sand holds traces that vanish with the next swell, a silent record of footsteps that should never exist. The Kópavogur attic disturbances. In the uppermost attic of a modest Kópavogur home, residents began noticing objects shifted from their usual positions without explanation. At first, it was minor. A book slid slightly from a shelf. A folded blanket moved atop a trunk. Yet as weeks passed, the changes became more pronounced, impossible to attribute to natural causes or absent-minded handling. The attic, with its low beams and narrow eaves, had long been a storage space for seldom-used items, and few household members ventured there regularly. Each morning, the family would find small pieces of furniture subtly displaced, cupboards ajar, and personal belongings in locations that no one admitted to moving. The irregularity of these disturbances created a tension that crept into the rhythms of daily life, prompting questions that had no straightforward answers. Footsteps and soft creaks echoed through the wooden beams during quiet evenings, often when no one was upstairs. The sound was faint but distinct, resonating in a house otherwise still. Some nights it occurred in sequences, as though an unseen visitor was pacing along the sloping floorboards, while on other nights it remained isolated, a single creak, a solitary thud. The family described listening in disbelief, straining to discern a source that might confirm a human presence, yet none was ever detected. Even pets reacted strangely, pausing mid-step or staring toward the attic stairs, alert to noises imperceptible to others. These auditory phenomena compounded the uncertainty of the physical evidence below, establishing the attic as a space of both material and psychological unease. The disturbances followed irregular patterns, appearing more frequently in the late hours of winter nights and during calm weather. During blizzards or stormy evenings, the attic remained quiet, almost as though the phenomenon preferred the tranquility of still air and frozen landscapes. Residents began noting a rhythm in the irregularity, tracking dates and times in an attempt to find predictability where none existed. Occasionally, the phenomena would cluster, with multiple objects displaced over successive nights, creating a cumulative sense of escalation. Yet these clusters were punctuated by long periods of silence, leaving the household unsure whether the activity had ceased or simply paused. The unpredictability reinforced an eerie tension, as the family could not prepare for or anticipate the next occurrence. Structural inspections and routine maintenance revealed no faults that could account for the repeated movement or noises. Carpenters and engineers examined the beams, flooring, and rafters, confirming that the attic was solid and stable. Drafts could not explain the displacement of heavier items, nor could thermal contraction account for repeated sequences that seemed deliberate. The family's possessions, some weighing several kilograms, were shifted in ways inconsistent with wind settling or minor tremors. While attic spaces often harbour strange sounds from ordinary settling, the observed combination of displacement, pacing sounds, and selective quiet was far from typical. Even seasoned professionals admitted the impossibility of attributing all phenomena to conventional causes. Over time, the incidents escalated. Boxes toppled, loose floorboards creaked under no discernible weight, and small items vanished only to reappear elsewhere. Personal notes, photographs, and objects stored for decades were found in new positions, as though sorted by an unseen hand. The family reported that some items would re-emerge weeks later, placed carefully atop surfaces or leaning against walls. Attempts to secure belongings in locked containers yielded inconsistent results, with items sometimes appearing outside their secured locations within days. The repetition and escalation suggested intentionality, yet there was no evidence of intrusion, no signs of forced entry, and no recordings of anyone entering the attic. Security cameras and audio recorders captured fleeting shadows and faint knocks, but the evidence was never conclusive. Video footage showed dark shapes moving at the edges of the frame, or blurs crossing the attic beams, often too quick or indistinct to identify. Audio devices recorded soft thumps, scuffing, or the subtle dragging of objects, yet timestamps rarely matched observed events, leaving investigators unsure whether the recordings reflected actual occurrences or ambient noise. Even when synchronized with direct observation, the devices provided tantalizing hints without proof, capturing the uncanny quality of the disturbances while leaving their source ambiguous. Neighbours and local historians recalled similar tales of unexplained domestic activity, suggesting that the phenomenon might have a historical precedent in the area. In some accounts, family homes of earlier generations experienced minor but persistent disturbances, moving objects, strange sounds, and impressions of presence without explanation. Folklorists noted that Icelandic traditions often attributed unexplained domestic anomalies to hidden people, spirits, or residual energies from past events. While these cultural references do not confirm the source of the Kópavogur attic incidents, they place the phenomenon within a broader historical and social context, suggesting that certain spaces can acquire layers of mystery over time. The family reported disrupted sleep and heightened anxiety, describing a sense that the attic itself was watchful, though nothing tangible could be seen. Children hesitated to enter alone, parents checked spaces repeatedly before retiring for the night, and the household rhythm shifted around the presence of an unexplained, unseen force. Psychological strain became evident, as ordinary concerns intertwined with the persistent uncertainty of whether the disturbances were natural, human, or something else entirely. These human responses provide insight into the power of sustained ambiguity, demonstrating how everyday environments can transform into zones of apprehension when confronted with unverified anomalies. Comparable cases in other Icelandic homes involved minor disturbances, yet Kópavogur's attic remained uniquely persistent in both frequency and intensity. While scattered reports exist of objects moving without explanation or of intermittent sounds in attics and lofts, few examples display the systematic repetition observed here. The sustained pattern over months, combined with the house's relative isolation and structural stability, distinguishes the Kópavogur case from typical minor domestic anomalies. Researchers studying these phenomena emphasize the rarity of events that are both consistent and resistant to ordinary explanation, marking this instance as particularly compelling. Investigators and curious onlookers continue to document occurrences, only to be met with transient and frustratingly ambiguous evidence. Even as new recordings, photographs, and notes accumulated, none provided definitive answers, leaving each visit to the attic both revealing and inconclusive. The combination of physical, auditory, and anecdotal evidence created a layered puzzle, rich in intrigue but stubbornly resistant to resolution. Every new attempt to capture the phenomenon reinforced the original mystery, underscoring the attic's enigmatic presence within the home and the broader community. Even now, the attic retains an unspoken presence, a quiet enigma that refuses to be explained or dismissed. The Reykjahlíð sky spiral. A luminous spiral unfolded high above Reykjahlíð, its motion precise yet unlike any cloud or aurora known to observers. On a clear winter evening, the formation appeared suddenly, twisting against the fading light in a way that caught the attention of villagers and travellers alike. Initial reports described a perfectly circular pattern, expanding slowly before tapering into a narrowing helix, as though the sky itself had been carved into a deliberate design. The unusual movement, coupled with a faint inner glow, suggested intentionality, yet no human explanation could account for the scale or mechanics. Residents and passers-by alike paused in the crisp air, their eyes drawn upward as the phenomenon rotated almost imperceptibly, leaving a lingering sense of otherworldly order. The spiral's sudden emergence and graceful motion became the subject of both local conversation and wider curiosity, prompting questions about whether it was a rare atmospheric event, a luminous optical illusion, or something more enigmatic. Colours shifted subtly along the spiral's edges, blending soft greens and pale golds that seemed almost deliberate in their arrangement. The shifting hues were never constant, appearing vibrant one moment and fading into transparency the next, as if the phenomenon were responsive to the changing light of the Icelandic dusk. Observers described how the glow seemed to ripple outward in concentric layers, giving the impression of depth and rotation that defied conventional observation. Some noted that the pattern appeared to interact with the low winter sun, refracting light in unexpected directions and producing fleeting, almost geometric shapes within the spiral's core. These subtle variations made the formation difficult to document but all the more mesmerizing, with each viewer perceiving the spiral in slightly different ways. Thin wisps of cirrus clouds drifted nearby, occasionally intersecting the formation and heightening the illusion of depth and rotation. At times, the spiral seemed partially obscured, as though it existed in layers behind and in front of the clouds, defying straightforward spatial interpretation. The interplay of cloud, air, and light added to the uncertainty of its scale, leaving viewers unsure whether the phenomenon was hundreds of meters above the village or far higher in the stratosphere. Shadows cast by the clouds occasionally cut across the spiral's glow, creating the impression of movement within movement. These interactions produced an experience that felt simultaneously natural and impossible, reinforcing the sense that the spiral existed in a realm that hovered between physical reality and perception. Attempts to classify the phenomenon through meteorological records and astronomical calculations produced inconsistencies that deepened the mystery. Winds were light and unremarkable, cloud cover minimal, and auroral activity modest, none of which could explain the spiral's rapid formation or sustained rotation. Researchers consulted local weather logs, solar activity records, and historical reports of similar formations, yet no combination of factors adequately accounted for the observations. Instruments designed to measure atmospheric anomalies detected minor fluctuations in temperature and pressure, but nothing conclusive, leaving the formation unaccounted for by conventional science. This persistent lack of explanation only amplified public fascination, with some speculating that the spiral represented a previously undocumented atmospheric or optical phenomenon. Cameras and telescopic lenses caught fleeting hints of structure, though rapid changes and variable light rendered each image partial and ambiguous. Some photographs captured a faint luminous helix, others recorded only a blurry halo or streak of colour. Video footage frequently showed the formation appearing and vanishing between frames, challenging conventional methods of documentation. The spiral's movement defied standard camera shutter speeds, making it almost impossible to preserve in full detail. Even high-resolution images, when analysed, revealed patterns that shifted upon closer inspection, as though the structure of the spiral itself was mutable, not fixed. This inconsistency frustrated both amateur photographers and professional scientists, leaving the phenomenon tantalizingly real yet frustratingly elusive. Old chronicles and local tales contain references to sky patterns that echo some aspects of the spiral, suggesting historical precedent for such anomalies. In Icelandic folklore, certain lights and aerial shapes were attributed to hidden forces or spirits, often marking events of unusual significance. While these stories cannot confirm the scientific reality of the spiral, they do indicate that communities in the region have long observed and recorded anomalous sky patterns. Accounts from previous centuries describe luminous shapes appearing above villages or over volcanic landscapes, sometimes lasting only minutes but leaving vivid impressions on witnesses. These historical parallels provide a cultural context, linking the modern observations to a tradition of unexplained aerial phenomena in Iceland. Sensations of both mesmerization and subtle disorientation accompanied the fascination and unease reported by those who observed. Some found themselves unable to tear their gaze from the spiral, compelled by its symmetry and movement, while others felt an inexplicable tension, a quiet awareness of something beyond ordinary experience. Children and adults alike commented on the unusual calm that followed, as if the sky had momentarily altered the rhythm of the village below. Even those with no prior interest in atmospheric phenomena described heightened perception, noting colours and motions invisible under normal circumstances. This collective experience reinforced the impression that the spiral was more than an optical curiosity. It was an event that affected both sight and sensation, leaving a subtle but lasting impact on those who witnessed it. The phenomenon of the spiral manifested with notable regularity during early evening hours, yet vanished without warning, leaving no trace of its path in the sky. Several residents charted its occurrences, noting that the formation often emerged after sunset when light levels were low but visibility remained adequate. Despite repeated sightings over weeks, the spiral never lingered long enough for extended measurement, fading almost as abruptly as it appeared. Observers attempting to predict its appearance found patterns unreliable, as minor variations in weather or atmospheric conditions could prevent or obscure its manifestation. The transitory nature of the event contributed to both its allure and its mystique, reinforcing the impression that it was governed by forces beyond human comprehension. Analysis by atmospheric scientists and astronomers has yielded plausible models, yet none fully reconcile all documented visual characteristics. Simulations of auroral vortices, optical refraction, and lenticular cloud spirals can approximate some elements, but fail to reproduce the observed motion, colour shifts, and rotation speed simultaneously. Specialists emphasise that while natural phenomena can be complex, the combination of features in the Reykjahlíð spiral remains unmatched in documented atmospheric events. Scientific literature contains no verified analogues with the same consistency of appearance and behaviour, leaving the formation firmly in the realm of unresolved mystery. Meticulous records and persistent monitoring reveal little about the formation, which continues to resist explanation, maintaining its status as an unsolved aerial anomaly. No single theory fully accounts for its emergence, persistence, or sudden disappearance. Its movement and coloration defy conventional atmospheric modelling, while its repeated, localised appearances above Reykjahlíð suggest a phenomenon with both specific spatial and temporal characteristics. The community continues to observe, document, and speculate, but the spiral remains elusive, a visible yet incomprehensible feature of the Icelandic sky. Above the silent village, the spiral persists, a twisting enigma that escapes understanding and defies every attempt at capture. The Hvalfjörður military echo. A low, reverberating sound began to ripple through Hvalfjörður, unsettling anyone nearby with its unexpected intensity. The phenomenon first drew attention during routine activity along the fjord, when fishermen noticed deep, resonant tones that seemed to come from nowhere. The sounds were unlike ordinary machinery or natural waves, carrying a mechanical precision but with an irregular cadence that resisted classification. Villagers reported hearing the echoes over vast distances, noting that the tones seemed amplified by the fjord's narrow channels and cliffs. At times, the noise appeared to respond to movement or environmental changes, rising when boats passed and fading in moments of still air. Local authorities received multiple reports, though initial investigations yielded little clarity. Audio recordings captured portions of the anomaly, yet each clip raised more questions than it answered, hinting at an origin both elusive and deeply embedded within the fjord's geography. The sound, noted by fishermen and hikers, was described as both mechanical and organic, rising and falling in ways that defied conventional explanation. Some compared it to the sound of distant engines reverberating through a canyon, yet there was no evidence of any such machinery. Others felt as though the sound had a living quality, pulsating with intentional rhythm and sometimes lingering in echoes long after its apparent source had disappeared. The resonance seemed to bend around corners, intensify at certain points, and vanish in others, leaving observers disoriented and searching for familiar cues. Those who spent extended periods in the fjord's vicinity reported headaches, nausea, or an inexplicable tension suggesting that the auditory phenomenon carried both psychological and physical impact. The fjord's cliffs and narrow channels create natural amplification, yet acoustic experts noted that the echoes exceeded what topography alone could produce. Sound engineers visiting Hvalfjörður attempted to model the acoustic environment, measuring cliff angles, water depth, and wave patterns. While reflections and refractions could account for some degree of resonance, the scale, consistency, and intensity of the echoes remained far beyond predictions. Experts noted that conventional echoing would fade within seconds, whereas this phenomenon persisted for minutes or even hours at irregular intervals. Seasonal temperature changes, wind patterns, and atmospheric pressure variations were examined, but no consistent correlation emerged, leaving the fjord's natural environment as only part of the puzzle. Hvalfjörður has a history of military activity, including sonar tests and naval exercises, which may have contributed to some but not all of the recorded phenomena. The fjord's strategic location made it an ideal site for testing underwater detection systems, and historical records confirm the presence of intermittent sonar and acoustic experiments. Some theorists proposed that echoes might originate from abandoned installations or residual sonar reflections interacting with geological formations. However, the timing of the most intense and unusual echoes did not always coincide with known exercises, and some sounds were documented during periods of inactivity. Military and local authorities have acknowledged the fjord's acoustic oddities, yet no comprehensive explanation has emerged. Measurements of frequency and amplitude captured anomalies that could not be replicated in controlled experiments, baffling acoustic engineers. Field devices registered irregular waveforms and tones that defied standard sonic models, with frequencies fluctuating unpredictably and intensities sometimes surpassing safe listening levels. Attempts to recreate the phenomenon in lab conditions failed, indicating that the fjord's unique combination of water, rock, and atmospheric factors might contribute in ways not yet understood. Even detailed spectral analysis produced irregular results, with some tones appearing harmonically unrelated to any identifiable source. These technical challenges reinforce the impression that Hvalfjörður itself played an active role in shaping the echoes, rather than simply transmitting them. Documents and recollections from past decades reveal comparable auditory anomalies, implying that these echoes are neither entirely new nor limited to one generation. Elderly residents recall incidents dating back decades, sometimes described as the voice of the fjord or the hidden hum of the cliffs. Written logs, diaries, and local newspaper reports occasionally mention unexplained resonances during calm weather or military exercises, hinting at a long-standing but sporadically documented mystery. Comparison of modern and historical accounts shows surprising consistency in description. Tones rising and falling unpredictably, a mixture of mechanical and organic qualities, and a sense that the sound emanates from the fjord itself rather than any visible object. During periods of sustained echoing, locals reported feelings of unease and disorientation, some even noting an instinctive urge to leave the area. Families recounted children becoming restless or frightened, pets reacting anxiously, and fishermen abandoning certain routes until the echoes faded. The auditory phenomenon seemed to affect perception, with people reporting difficulty judging distance, height, or direction during episodes. Folklore occasionally interpreted the sounds as warnings or messages from spirits of the fjord, reflecting a cultural attempt to rationalize something beyond human comprehension. The psychological impact of the echoes contributed to both fear and fascination, cementing the fjord's reputation as a place of auditory mystery. Audio recordings reveal patterns that shift unpredictably, with certain tones appearing and disappearing without any identifiable source. Researchers analyzing long-duration recordings noted intervals where the sound intensified, sometimes layering multiple tones in apparent opposition. Attempts to pinpoint the origin using triangulation techniques were repeatedly confounded by inconsistent propagation, irregular reflections, and the fjord's unique underwater acoustics. Some recordings captured tones that seemed to come from beneath the water's surface, while others appeared airborne, creating the impression of a multi-dimensional sonic event. The complexity of these recordings only added to the challenge of understanding the phenomenon, as each new dataset produced more questions than answers. Extensive monitoring and investigation have yielded no conclusive explanation, leaving the origin of the echoes an open question. Multiple independent teams, including acoustic engineers, geologists, and military analysts, have attempted to correlate observations with environmental, structural, and technological variables. None has been able to reconcile all aspects of the phenomenon, leaving room for speculation ranging from rare atmospheric effects to unexplained interactions between water and rock. The inability to identify a single source contributes to the fjord's enigmatic reputation, ensuring that it remains a subject of scientific curiosity as well as local lore. Ongoing observations continue to challenge both military and scientific understanding, as the fjord itself seems to conceal its secrets. Investigators have returned season after season, documenting events in logs, photographs, and audio recordings, but patterns remain inconsistent and elusive. The combination of environmental factors, human activity, and the fjord's natural acoustics produces a situation where explanation seems perpetually just out of reach. While technology advances and more sophisticated monitoring is deployed, the echoes resist categorization, evoking both awe and trepidation in those who study them. Floating over the fjord, the mysterious echoes of Hvalfjörður linger in the air, defying logic and leaving listeners to wonder what truly resonates beneath the fjord's surface. The vanished lights of Vik's sea caves. Faint glimmers began to appear along the mouth of Vik's sea caves, catching the attention of those navigating the shoreline at dusk. The initial reports came from fishermen returning from evening excursions, who noticed unexpected flickers reflecting across the waves. Unlike ordinary reflections from the setting sun or passing vessels, these lights moved with an almost deliberate rhythm, appearing and disappearing in sequences that suggested intelligence or pattern. Tourists walking along the black sand beach also reported sudden bursts of illumination within the caves, often vanishing before they could be fully observed. Local authorities received sporadic accounts, some dismissed as optical illusions, yet the frequency and consistency of sightings over the years suggested a phenomenon worthy of further attention. Photographers and amateur videographers attempted to capture the lights, but even when recorded, the phenomenon appeared distorted, ephemeral, and impossible to fully quantify. Each new observation deepened the mystery, leaving witnesses and investigators alike questioning the nature of these inexplicable illuminations. During sightings, lights were observed pulsing with an intensity unlike ordinary reflections, shifting colour and shape in ways that defied natural explanation. Some reported small, concentrated points of brightness that expanded into broad, hazy glows before retreating again. Colours varied from stark white to pale blue, sometimes merging into brief streaks of amber or green, with no discernible source for the chromatic changes. Observers often noticed movement against the tide or wind, suggesting that the lights were not simply the product of wave action or cave acoustics. A handful of accounts described the lights as following the contours of the cliffs, weaving through cracks and openings, then vanishing altogether without warning. Such behaviour, if accurately reported, suggested a phenomenon that interacted with the cave environment in ways beyond conventional optics. Fear and wonder mingled in equal measure, as those witnessing the events were often left mesmerised, yet unsettled by the unexplained display. Basalt columns and jagged cliffs shaped the coastline in a labyrinthine pattern, yet the lights often seemed to move independently of the terrain. The caves themselves extend inward beneath towering cliffs, forming narrow passageways that reflect and scatter light unpredictably. Despite this, the luminous occurrences frequently appeared in open spaces, hovering or shifting without apparent contact with the rock surfaces. Geologists visiting the site noted that while certain alcoves could amplify natural reflections, the timing and intensity of the lights exceeded what could be explained by geology alone. Occasional sea spray and fog could scatter light, but recordings showed instances during clear conditions, reinforcing the sense that something unusual was at play. The spatial distribution of the lights, as reported by multiple observers from different vantage points, created a disorienting experience in which the phenomenon appeared to defy the normal physics of reflection. In efforts to document the phenomenon, cameras captured fleeting streaks or bursts that escaped the unaided eye. High-speed photography revealed transient glows and sudden flashes, often localized and then gone within milliseconds. Spectral analysis of the recordings occasionally showed frequencies outside the visible range, though equipment limitations and environmental factors complicated interpretation. Attempts to use drones or other remote recording devices often failed, as the lights either disappeared or appeared differently through lenses than in direct observation. Some scientists suggested that micro-reflections on salt crystals or bioluminescent organisms could explain portions of the phenomenon, yet the scale, colour variety and duration of many sightings exceeded expectations for natural sources. Even controlled experiments in simulated cave environments failed to replicate the same intensity or behaviour of the lights. Sightings appear to follow irregular schedules, sometimes coinciding with high tides or fog, but other occurrences emerged under clear, calm skies. No consistent pattern emerged regarding season, weather, or time of day, although certain periods saw clusters of reports. Some fishermen noted that unusually high or low tides seemed to trigger early appearances, while visitors reported lights during periods of still, moonlit nights with no discernible movement of water. The unpredictable timing added to the psychological impact, as individuals never knew when or where the lights might emerge. Attempts to forecast appearances using tide charts, lunar cycles, or meteorological data were largely unsuccessful, leaving both scientists and lay observers frustrated. Older maritime records and local folklore recount luminous occurrences in the caves, often interpreted as omens or the presence of hidden spirits. Historical texts from coastal communities described wandering lights or sea spirits that appeared along the cliffs near Vik, guiding or warning sailors. Fishermen passed down oral accounts of lights that danced above the water, sometimes leading small boats to safer passages, other times vanishing suddenly with an unsettling silence. Local myths attributed these phenomena to supernatural beings or the restless spirits of the sea, a cultural explanation bridging centuries of observation. While modern observers approach the lights with scientific curiosity, the enduring nature of these stories lends weight to the suggestion that the phenomenon has persisted for generations, observed under countless conditions, and interpreted in diverse ways. Hypotheses ranging from bioluminescent organisms to optical distortions have been proposed, yet none fully accounts for the unpredictability and intensity of the lights. Bioluminescent plankton might explain brief glows near the water's surface, but the lights frequently appeared inside the caves or above the waves, in locations unreachable by marine life. Optical illusions such as refraction or reflection from the cliff walls accounted for some visual effects, but not for the abrupt colour changes or pulsing behaviour reported by observers. Electrical or atmospheric explanations have been considered, including triboluminescence or rare ionisation events, yet these remain speculative and inconsistent with the documented patterns. Despite extensive theorising, the lights continue to resist categorisation, leaving an air of unresolved mystery. Tourists and residents alike described a mix of awe and unease, with some avoiding the caves entirely after witnessing the phenomena firsthand. Photographers returned to review blurred images, hikers recounted nights spent watching flickering forms across the water, and guides occasionally altered their routes to avoid areas of particularly intense sightings. Witnesses reported physical reactions, from heightened alertness to a creeping sense of dread, suggesting that the lights carried both visual and psychological weight. Conversations with those who had observed the phenomenon revealed a shared sense of respect and caution, as if the lights signalled forces beyond simple comprehension. The unpredictability reinforced a collective recognition that Vik's sea caves harbour more than their geological formations alone might suggest. Persistent attempts at documentation and observation have failed to explain the light's origin and mechanism, frustrating both scientists and casual onlookers. Teams have returned season after season with high-powered cameras, spectral analyzers, and comprehensive logs. Yet each investigation highlights new anomalies. The phenomenon exhibits a selective visibility, appearing sometimes for a single observer while eluding others in the same location. Attempts to simulate or reproduce the lights have failed repeatedly, reinforcing the notion that the caves themselves, or some hidden process within, play a role in shaping what appears to those who watch. Even with continued scrutiny, the phenomenon remains a puzzle defying logical closure. Ongoing visits continue to document the light's enigmatic behaviour, hinting at a phenomenon that defies simple explanation or categorization. Observers note fleeting flashes, pulses of colour, and sudden absences that make each encounter unique. The combination of geological complexity, marine activity, and the unpredictability of the lights creates a setting where traditional scientific approaches are continually challenged. Each new sighting renews interest while deepening uncertainty, suggesting that Vik's sea caves retain a secret that is as alluring as it is inaccessible. Beyond the breaking surf, the vanished lights of Vik's sea caves flicker and vanish, leaving a question that no measurement or lens has yet been able to answer. The sheep that gathered at Oddi. Morning mist clung to the slopes of Oddi as a farmer noticed the flock assembling in ways that defied ordinary grazing patterns. Normally dispersed across the rolling pastures, the sheep moved toward a single central point, leaving behind abandoned feeding areas. The farmer's first thought was of some disturbance, a predator or unusual noise, but the hills were quiet, the air still, and the usual signs of danger absent. Other residents soon noticed the unusual gathering, describing an eerie calm punctuated by the rhythmic bleating of the flock. What made the event more perplexing was the absence of a shepherd guiding the animals. They seemed to have chosen the meeting point themselves, converging with an unsettling synchrony that was both captivating and unnerving. Accounts of this congregation spread quickly, and by mid-morning several locals had come to witness the phenomenon firsthand, their presence doing little to disturb the flock's unusual arrangement. Sudden formations emerged, with sheep clustering tightly in spirals, and lines that seemed purposeful yet lacked a visible leader. Witnesses described clusters forming around small rock outcrops, with some flocks pausing as though taking cues from invisible markers along the ground. The pattern shifted every few minutes, creating intricate shapes that vanished as quickly as they formed. Observers tried to count the animals, noting that more than 150 sheep participated in this odd choreography, far exceeding the number usually present in the surrounding pastures. Photographs captured the spirals from higher vantage points, but even the images failed to convey the full peculiarity of the movements, which appeared coordinated beyond any ordinary instinctual behaviour. The phenomenon drew both fascination and anxiety, as locals exchanged theories and debated whether natural or supernatural forces might be at play. Across the jagged hillsides and narrow valleys, the animals moved with unexpected precision, traversing distances they rarely covered in a single day. Sheep crossed rocky ridges and shallow streams, navigating slopes that would normally scatter their herd instinct into more random formations. The terrain itself presented a puzzle. Sheep generally follow familiar routes for grazing and shelter, yet these flocks seemed to respond to an unseen guide. Paths previously untravelled became temporary corridors for their movement, as if the land itself had become a stage for this inexplicable assembly. Even long-time farmers, familiar with the behaviour of their flocks, admitted astonishment at the distances covered and the cohesion maintained throughout. The terrain of Oddi, with its mixture of fjords, hills and meadows, amplified the strangeness, creating a scene simultaneously natural and impossibly orchestrated. Ancient farm journals reference similar inexplicable gatherings, suggesting that the phenomenon may have been quietly recurring for generations. Some entries speak of sheep marching to the fjord or assembling without reason, recorded in the early 19th century and passed down through local families. Folklore intertwines with these reports, framing the gatherings as omens or messages from the land itself, warnings or portents of unusual weather. Oral accounts describe elders observing the sheep and refusing to interfere, believing that the animals were guided by forces beyond human understanding. These historical notes lend weight to the idea that what occurs at Oddi is neither entirely new nor simply a quirk of modern farming. The continuity of these reports across centuries underscores the enigmatic nature of the phenomenon and challenges purely rational explanations. Technicians brought motion-sensitive cameras and GPS collars, documenting patterns that confounded conventional understanding of herd dynamics. Data collected revealed unusual pauses, sudden accelerations, and unexpected directional changes that did not correspond to terrain, food availability, or predator threats. Analysis of speed and trajectory indicated that individual sheep often adjusted movements in near-perfect unison, a level of coordination rarely observed in ungulates. Observers also noted that the animals occasionally formed elongated lines that curved around natural obstacles, reassembling after navigating tricky ground with remarkable fluidity. The technology allowed for the visualization of patterns invisible to the naked eye, confirming that the phenomenon was not merely a coincidental gathering, but a sustained and organized event that demanded explanation. Shifting winds and changing weather seemed to have little effect, as the gatherings appeared regardless of rain, sun, or sudden storms. Sheep assembled in similar formations during clear, calm mornings and during periods of dense fog, suggesting that visibility or environmental cues were not necessary triggers. The behaviour was consistent across days with drastically different conditions, challenging the notion that the flock's movements were simply reactive. Even sudden gusts or shifting temperatures did not deter the coordinated patterns, implying that some intrinsic, perhaps unseen, factor guided the animals. Locals began to speak of an invisible rhythm, a pulse to which the sheep responded, though its origin remained entirely speculative. Inquiries into whether predators, magnetic fields, or human activity were responsible yielded no clear answers, leaving observers frustrated and intrigued. Scientists considered the presence of large predators in the surrounding hills, unusual geomagnetic activity, and potential herding efforts, but each hypothesis failed to account for the scale, timing, and precision observed. No evidence of human guidance, food incentives, or external manipulation was found. Even specialized studies on sheep navigation and collective behavior could not fully explain the phenomenon, which defied the predictable parameters of the species' known instincts. The inability to pin down a cause only heightened the mystery, reinforcing the sense that the Oddi gatherings were beyond ordinary understanding. Communities around Oddi treated the events with cautious respect, quietly observing the flocks without attempting to disrupt their behavior. Farmers allowed the sheep to roam freely, documenting movements with notes, cameras, and personal observation. Some villagers incorporated the phenomenon into local storytelling, framing it as a natural wonder that demanded both attention and humility. Curious visitors occasionally arrived, drawn by reports of the assembly, yet most were advised to watch from a distance, respecting the sheep's unusual autonomy. The combination of awe, reverence, and unanswered questions created a shared consciousness in the community, acknowledging that the phenomenon was as much a mystery of place as of behaviour. By nightfall, the flock vanished as silently as it had assembled, leaving behind an enigma that no herder or scientist has yet unravelled. The sudden silence of Þingvellir Gorge. Footsteps echoed unevenly on the gravel path as hikers ascended the gorge, their conversations fading into the distance until an unfamiliar stillness pressed against them from every direction. The air seemed heavier than usual, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and moss, but devoid of the usual ambient hum of flowing water and distant bird calls. Those who had traversed Þingvellir many times remarked on how strange it felt, the absence of sound giving the landscape an almost physical weight, as if the cliffs themselves were holding their breath. Within moments the quiet became oppressive, filling every corner of the gorge, leaving even the most seasoned visitors disoriented by a void they could neither name nor explain. Observers later recalled that it was not sudden in the conventional sense. The transition was subtle, a fading of noise, until all that remained was a profound emptiness. It was in that emptiness that the reports of the sudden silence began to circulate among hikers and park staff, documented with meticulous care and often accompanied by photographs showing serene yet oddly unsettling vistas. While scientists would later debate the causes, at the moment no one knew what had silenced the gorge. Normally, wind weaves through the fissures, carrying distant waterfalls and the calls of birds that give Þingvellir its perpetual soundtrack. Streams rush along the jagged rock faces, cascading into pools that sparkle in sunlight, creating a constant rhythmic backdrop. Even on the calmest days, the gorge produces a subtle symphony of natural sound. The rustle of small creatures among the undergrowth, the low hum of insects, and the murmur of currents hidden just beyond sight. It is this consistency that makes the absence of sound so jarring. Hikers reported feeling as though they had stepped into another world, one where time itself had paused to listen. The familiar harmony of geological and biological activity was gone, replaced by a hollow stillness that left the senses oddly heightened. Every movement became unnaturally loud, every footstep a solitary percussion in a landscape that had fallen mute. Some visitors instinctively stopped, their heads tilting toward the cliffs, realizing that the familiar hum of the gorge had vanished without warning. Conversations were abandoned mid-sentence, replaced by cautious whispers and glances exchanged over pale, questioning faces. The quiet seemed to bend perception, elongating distances and exaggerating shadows along the path. Some hikers described a sensation of being watched, though no eyes were visible, only the cliffs and fissures looming silently. Those who had travelled to Þingvellir specifically for its beauty began to experience a kind of awe tinged with fear, a recognition that the gorge could assert its own presence in ways entirely unrelated to human expectation. It was as though the landscape had chosen to communicate in the absence rather than in sound. Water channels, etched over millennia, appeared frozen in time, their trickles and splashes strangely absent, leaving an almost tangible emptiness. Streams that usually babbled over basalt stones and spilled into hidden pools now produced no audible evidence of their flow. Even waterfalls that typically thundered down sheer rock faces seemed muted, their force visible but silent. Geologists and hydrologists would later note that there was no apparent blockage, no change in water levels, and no natural obstruction capable of silencing the gorge so completely. The effect was not partial, it enveloped the entirety of the accessible gorge, creating a surreal uniformity of quiet. Hikers described walking alongside normally boisterous streams and feeling a sense of unreality settle over their surroundings, as if sound had been stolen rather than paused. Historical accounts suggest that sudden silences in the gorge are rare but not unheard of, often entwined with local superstition or unexplained natural phenomena. Farmers' journals from the 19th century occasionally mention days when the gorge sleeps, noting eerie calm over land usually filled with movement. Folktales describe the phenomenon as a warning, a sign that the land itself was shifting in response to unseen forces. While many of these accounts are anecdotal, they share a remarkable consistency in describing a comprehensive, enveloping silence. The repetition of such accounts across centuries lends weight to the idea that the phenomenon is not entirely new, even if it remains unexplained in modern terms. Studies of wind currents, air pressure, and seismic activity have revealed no explanation for the abrupt absence of sound, deepening the mystery. Studies conducted during similar events have failed to detect any measurable disruption capable of muting a gorge of this size. There are no known magnetic anomalies or seismic shifts that align with the reports of silence, and atmospheric conditions, while occasionally unusual, appear insufficient to account for the sudden stillness. Attempts to replicate the experience in controlled conditions have yielded no comparable effect, leaving scientists perplexed. Each investigation reaffirms the uniqueness of the event and emphasizes how a natural environment so thoroughly understood can still resist explanation. Attempts to identify patterns proved inconclusive, as the silence occurred at varying times and conditions, defying any predictable cause. Sometimes it coincided with clear sunny afternoons, at other times with the low rumble of storms approaching the horizon. Hikers, researchers, and park staff compiled logs for years, hoping to discern correlations, but the phenomenon appeared erratic. The lack of predictability amplified its unsettling quality, as those entering the gorge could never be certain whether they would encounter normal soundscapes or the haunting stillness that has perplexed visitors for generations. Visitors and park staff alike recount a shared unease, noting how the normally lively landscape suddenly becomes a stage for heightened awareness and tension. The quiet forces attention toward the smallest details, the flutter of a leaf, the shift of sunlight on basalt, the distant shimmer of a stream invisible but imagined. Many describe a sense of reverence mingled with apprehension, a recognition that the gorge can impose its own presence independently of human perception. Some hikers leave the trails shaken, others inspired, but all carry the memory of a silence that is as tangible as the cliffs themselves. Darkness creeping across the cliffs brought a persistent silence, leaving a question hanging over the gorge that no voice could answer. The missing fisherman of Flaty Island. Small wooden skiffs lined the shore of Flaty Island, each tied and waiting as the sea held a quiet, unbroken surface, yet one fisherman never returned from his usual route. The island, tiny and relatively isolated, had long depended on the daily rhythm of its fishermen, who navigated the surrounding channels with intimate knowledge of tides and currents. On that particular morning, routine preparations appeared ordinary. Nets were mended, oars checked, and supplies loaded, yet the absence of one man would ripple through the small community in ways no one anticipated. The channels surrounding Flaty have long posed challenges for navigation, with hidden rocks and shifting tides documented in maritime charts used by locals for decades. The waters around the island, though often calm, could transform abruptly, funneling currents in unpredictable directions between submerged outcrops. Experienced fishermen were cautious, understanding the power of the Atlantic even on seemingly still days. Yet the missing man, known for his diligence and familiarity with these waters, vanished without the usual signals that accompany maritime mishaps. No overturned boat, no debris, no trail of evidence to suggest a sudden accident. Villagers recalled the morning in vivid detail, noting the fisherman checking lines, securing gear, and carefully observing weather conditions as he prepared to leave. Everything appeared ordinary. There was no storm, no unusual swell, nothing to hint that his routine journey would end in disappearance. Hours passed, and when the skiff remained at sea longer than expected, unease spread. It was not until the vessel returned empty, tied to the dock without its occupant, that alarm truly settled over the small settlement. For those who watched him depart, the sudden absence felt incomprehensible, almost surreal. Search efforts began immediately, extending along the shoreline and into the bay. Neighbours launched small rowboats to trace potential routes, scanning the water carefully for any sign of the fisherman. Observers combed the shoreline, inspecting tidal pools, rocky outcrops and drift patterns, hoping to discover some trace of him. Every effort returned empty. The sea remained placid, almost indifferent, refusing to offer the smallest clue to explain what had occurred. Each unsuccessful sweep heightened the sense of unease, transforming ordinary observation into a tense exercise in anticipation and dread. Records of the surrounding waters note occasional unexplained disappearances, often attributed to sudden currents or miscalculations, yet each incident left lingering questions for the islanders. Histories of Fletti and nearby islands document accidents that seemed ordinary at first. A skiff capsized, a rope snapped, a sudden tide, but occasionally even the most careful fishermen vanished entirely. These past events, while rarely spoken of outside maritime circles, had shaped the community's cautious approach to the sea. In this case, however, the disappearance defied familiar patterns, resisting conventional explanation and deepening the islanders' worry. The community debated practical possibilities, considering submerged rocks, sudden squalls, or misjudged tides as potential causes, while acknowledging that none of these could fully account for the fisherman's vanishing. His expertise and careful planning made accidental miscalculation unlikely. Each explanation raised further questions, and the absence of debris or a signal compounded the mystery. Conversation shifted from routine speculation to a quieter, reflective unease, as residents realized that no ordinary accident could explain the situation, leaving the unknown as the only remaining constant. Authorities and maritime investigators were consulted, reviewing tide tables, wind records, and navigation charts in an attempt to reconstruct the fisherman's path. Coastguards and local experts analysed every factor they could measure: currents, weather shifts, and even the effects of minor storms that could have passed unnoticed. All calculations confirmed what the villagers already suspected. Nothing in the records accounted for the complete disappearance. The man had simply vanished, leaving the method and reasoning as unknown as the open sea itself. Each analysis reinforced the mystery rather than resolving it. Life on Fletti continued, as it always did, with the rhythms of the island carrying forward through daily chores, fishing and supply deliveries from the mainland. Yet the absence of the fisherman remained a point of quiet reflection for those who had seen him last, a persistent question that hung over conversations and work alike. Children noted his missing presence during meals, neighbours noticed his empty seat at gatherings, and even the smallest tasks seemed shadowed by the unresolved nature of the event. The ordinary routines of the island were interrupted subtly but irrevocably, each day underscoring the strangeness of the disappearance. The disappearance of the fisherman was not only an unsolved case, but also a lingering enigma that shaped the island's perception of its environment. Residents could no longer view the waters with casual familiarity. Each tide, each current carried the memory of absence. While daily life pressed on, the questions persisted. How could a skilled, careful man vanish entirely without a trace? And why did the sea, usually so full of sound and movement, offer no answer? The unknown stretched across the horizon as definitively as the waters themselves. No sign, no explanation, and no clue lingered, Only the silent expanse of the sea held the answer that would never come. The unclaimed screams of Helgafell. Even in the quietest corners of Western Iceland, certain nights carry a resonance that unsettles the most seasoned travellers, and among these is the persistent enigma of Helgafell. Nestled near the southern edge of Borgarfjörður, the slopes of this modest mountain have long been noted for an eerie phenomenon that has baffled hikers, residents and researchers alike. Night hikers, often seeking the stillness of the terrain after dusk, have reported hearing human-like screams echoing across the slopes, a chilling sound that rises abruptly from the otherwise silent landscape. These are not fleeting yelps or the calls of distant birds, but loud, anguished cries that carry over hills and gullies in a manner both precise and terrifying. Local authorities first began logging reports in the late 20th century, noting that visitors who approached the area after sunset often left shaken, recounting the sounds in detail, yet finding no sign of any person or animal. Residents of nearby farms recall hearing similar screams themselves, sometimes from the comfort of their homes, amplifying a sense of dread as the cries seem to draw nearer before fading without a trace. Hikers have described the screams as coming from multiple directions simultaneously, a disorienting effect that leaves a lingering uncertainty about where the source might lie. Attempts to triangulate the sounds using basic acoustic measurements have proven inconclusive, revealing only that the noises are consistent with human vocal frequencies, but originate from points inaccessible or uninhabited. Even professional search teams sent to investigate during reported incidents have found nothing. In 1983, a small group of volunteers combed the slopes for several hours following a night of reported screams. They encountered no hikers, animals or evidence of disturbance, only the intact landscape and the faint echo of voices that seemed suspended in the thin, cold air. Equipment designed to record sound anomalies captured audio of the cries, but attempts to analyse the recordings for environmental interference yielded no answers. The pattern of the screams also defies natural explanation. They occur sporadically, sometimes for several consecutive nights, and at other times vanish entirely for months, creating a cycle that appears without warning. Geological surveys of Helgafell offer little insight. The mountain is a relatively small formation, composed largely of basaltic rock and volcanic soil, and lacks any caverns or fissures deep enough to produce natural echoes that could mimic human shouting. Local hydrology is similarly unremarkable, with only minor streams running down its slopes, insufficient to create sounds of such intensity. Biologists and wildlife experts have considered the possibility of bird or animal calls being misinterpreted, particularly in the dense twilight that precedes full darkness, yet the descriptions from witnesses consistently reject this explanation. Even those familiar with the nocturnal calls of foxes, owls and migrating birds insist the screams do not match any known species. Eyewitness accounts also reveal a peculiar psychological effect associated with the screams. Hikers and farmers alike describe a sudden visceral fear upon hearing the sounds, an instinctive feeling of imminent danger that compels them to retreat. Many report that the echoes seem almost conscious, adjusting in volume and distance as if aware of the listener's movements. Those who pause or attempt to locate the source often describe a sensation of being observed, though no physical presence is ever detected. In some instances, hikers have attempted to stay overnight in tents or small cabins near the slopes, only to awaken to the cries moving closer, as if circling the encampment, then receding without pattern. Historical records, though sparse, suggest the phenomenon may not be entirely new. Folklore surrounding Helgafell includes vague references to wandering spirits and cries heard during long Icelandic winters, though these mentions are anecdotal and not systematically documented. Some scholars suggest that the region's geological features could create rare acoustic anomalies, particularly under specific atmospheric conditions. Still, these theories fail to account for the consistency of reports over decades. Each investigation, whether by academics, journalists, or local enthusiasts, ends with the same unanswered question: what or who is responsible for the cries that seem to possess both volume and purpose yet remain unseen? Efforts to catalogue the incidents have grown more sophisticated in recent years. Sound recording devices are left on the slopes, GPS trackers monitor human movement, and thermal imaging cameras scan the terrain, all in hopes of capturing a definitive clue. Despite these measures, the phenomenon continues to elude explanation. Occasionally the recordings capture nothing at all, while on other nights the screams emerge clearly, compellingly, yet without any traceable source. The pattern, if there is one, remains beyond the grasp of logic or prediction. Those who frequent the area now speak of the phenomenon with a mixture of reverence and caution. Guides will refuse to lead hikers on evening excursions, and families living nearby often close shutters and lock doors well before nightfall. Scholars visiting the area maintain a professional detachment, yet even they report a lingering unease when standing in silence on the slopes as darkness falls. The sound itself has become almost mythic, a signal in the dark that something beyond ordinary perception may be present, whether natural, psychological, or something else entirely. Helgafell, once a quiet hill among the fjords, has earned its reputation not through one dramatic event, but through countless small, inexplicable occurrences that accumulate into a pervasive sense of dread. The unclaimed screams continue to ripple through the mountain's folds, a reminder that some aspects of the Icelandic landscape resist understanding, preserving mysteries that no search party, experiment or recording device has yet unravelled. The cries rise again tonight, reaching into the empty valley with no one there to answer. The glowing ridge of Breiðdalsvík. The ridge of Breiðdalsvík stretches across the horizon, its outline suddenly pierced by a soft red glow that defies any visible source. From a distance, the light appears almost deliberate, painting the ridge in a hue that contrasts sharply with the surrounding darkness of the valley below. Travellers and geologists alike have noted that the phenomenon seems to appear shortly after minor seismic tremors, though these quakes register only faintly on sensitive instruments, leaving the ridge itself calm and unchanged. The glow has no accompanying heat, no volcanic activity, and no trace of fire or human interference, yet it persists with a quiet insistence that draws both curiosity and unease. Observers often pause, unsure whether to dismiss the sight as a trick of the eye, or accept that something unexplainable is unfolding before them. On rare nights, the light flares with sudden intensity, creating a striking contrast against the inky blackness of the surrounding mountains, only to diminish again to a subtle, almost imperceptible glow. Witnesses travelling along the valley speak of the light shifting subtly in intensity, as though tracing invisible lines across the slope rather than remaining fixed. Some describe it as pulsing gently, with a rhythm that suggests awareness or motion, though nothing physically moves along the ridge. One geologist noted that the glow occasionally appears to rise along the slope, vanishing and then reappearing slightly higher, as if the ridge itself were breathing or flowing with an internal energy. Hikers recount watching the glow flare for moments before dimming, only to reappear along a different section of the ridge, leaving an impression of deliberate choreography. One group of scientists documented the phenomenon from a vantage point several kilometres away, noting that binoculars revealed no discernible source, and yet the glow persisted with a consistency that defied natural expectation. Observers emphasise a strange sense of calm mixed with unease, a feeling that the ridge itself is communicating in a language entirely alien to human understanding. Rock formations along the ridge consist primarily of solidified lava, with layers of basalt and volcanic tuff dominating the surface. Despite the region's volcanic history, current geological surveys reveal no magma flow, fissures, or thermal anomalies capable of producing a luminous red glow. The valley's geomorphology is otherwise unremarkable, shaped by centuries of erosion and glacial retreat, yet these seemingly ordinary slopes hold a visual anomaly that continues to evade explanation. Surveys conducted with ground-penetrating radar and soil composition tests have yielded no unusual readings, reinforcing the impression that the glow emerges independently of any known geological process. Even minor streams that traverse the valley cannot reflect or amplify light in a manner sufficient to account for the intensity described by observers. Scientists monitoring the area with thermal and seismic instruments report no heat signatures or movements corresponding to the luminous phenomena. Night vision cameras capture only the light itself, with no evidence of machinery, reflective materials, or any human-made sources. Seismographs detect only minor, routine tremors that rarely correlate precisely with reported appearances of the glow. Attempts to capture the phenomenon on time-lapse photography reveal only erratic bursts of red, flaring and fading without predictable intervals. Some researchers have even employed drones to hover near the ridge at night, yet infrared imaging confirms that the area remains at ambient temperatures, and the glow remains impervious to direct observation or measurement. Each experiment deepens the puzzle, as the ridge appears to emit a form of light without any mechanism that aligns with known physics. The glow appears irrespective of cloud cover, temperature or wind, challenging conventional explanations drawn from atmospheric optics. Meteorologists suggest that unusual refractive effects could sometimes amplify distant lights, yet the consistency of the red hue, its location along the ridge, and its sporadic movements defy these assumptions. Seasonal variations offer no pattern either. Sightings have occurred in early spring when nights are long and cold, as well as in late summer under clear skies. Even during nights of auroral activity, the red glow remains distinct and unaffected, a solitary visual anomaly that refuses to conform to natural expectations. Researchers analysing satellite imagery have also failed to detect any corresponding emissions, reinforcing the conclusion that the light is localised, peculiar, and entirely unexplained. Residents in nearby settlements describe standing quietly at a distance, compelled to watch the illumination flicker along the ridge without ever approaching it. Farmers returning home in the late evening often slow their vehicles or pause entirely to observe, reporting an almost hypnotic effect that draws attention while instilling a quiet tension. Guides leading excursions through Breiðdalsvík have learned to warn hikers of the ridge's occasional red display, explaining that while no immediate danger exists, the visual is unsettling enough to distract from navigation and natural awareness. Some residents report noticing that animals, particularly sheep and grazing horses, occasionally react to the glow by becoming unusually alert or retreating to lower ground, suggesting that even wildlife senses something unusual. Local law, sparse and cautious, treats the light as an anomaly to witness respectfully, rather than a hazard to confront directly. In reviewing the records, connections between sightings and tremors or lunar cycles proved inconsistent, deepening the mystery with every unexplained occurrence. On some nights, minor tremors precede the glow by minutes, while on others, it appears without any measurable Earth movement. Moonlight seems equally irrelevant, with sightings reported under both full moons and new moons alike. Researchers maintaining observation logs note that the glow's duration can range from fleeting moments to hours-long displays, yet no combination of factors consistently predicts its emergence. Even the presence of clouds or fog seems insufficient to explain the anomaly, as the glow persists through varying conditions, untouched by the environment around it. The red light lingers along the ridge long enough to imprint itself in memory, yet vanishes before anyone can uncover its origin. The postal road walker. A solitary figure has been seen along the old Kaldidalur route, appearing suddenly on quiet nights before vanishing as vehicles draw near. Those who have encountered him often describe a man walking alone, with no pack, no discernible movement beyond steady steps, and an inexplicable presence that seems both real and unreal at the same time. Travellers report the figure appearing just beyond the curves of the road or alongside lava ridges, a fleeting vision that vanishes the instant one tries to approach or illuminate it with headlights. The highland air is crisp and thin at this elevation, yet the walker gives no indication of fatigue or haste, continuing onward, as if moving along a path invisible to the human eye. Repeated accounts from drivers and hikers suggest that the figure is not merely a shadow or misperception. There is a consistent solidity to his form, a quiet insistence that commands attention while resisting contact. Travellers describe the walker moving with deliberate pace, carrying an indistinct presence that seems aware of observers yet remains untouchable. Some recount the figure's posture as upright and purposeful, neither hurried nor hesitant, and note that he rarely deviates from the narrow road itself. When first spotted, he appears distant and ordinary, but the moment headlights or approaching footsteps attempt to close the gap, he disappears entirely, leaving only the empty stretch of gravel or dirt behind. Observers often experience a jarring sense of disbelief, a simultaneous recognition that the figure is real, and the certainty that he cannot be caught or followed. In several instances, two independent drivers passing in opposite directions reported seeing the figure at nearly the same location, vanishing for both without warning, adding a layer of inexplicable consistency to the phenomenon. The Kaldidalur postal road climbs through rugged terrain, rising over barren hills where few venture and human presence is rare. Historically, the route served as a lifeline between isolated highland settlements used to transport mail and supplies long before modern highways crossed the island. Today, only occasional drivers and adventurous hikers traverse the path, leaving it largely empty and lending an eerie stillness to the surroundings. Lava beds, fissures, and scattered boulders define much of the landscape, while glacial streams carve shallow gullies across the plateau. The remoteness of the route amplifies the sense of isolation, making any human, or seemingly human, presence feel abrupt, out of place, and profoundly unsettling. Shifting light and intermittent snow flurries can distort perception, yet the walker's sudden disappearance defies any explanation rooted in weather or visibility. Witnesses have reported seeing him in clear starlight, as well as during drifting snow, in conditions where shadows should be sharply defined and every ridge and rock plainly visible. Some travellers initially assume their eyes are playing tricks, only to find that the figure's movements are too consistent to be dismissed. Observers note that even when the road curves or dips, the figure appears to maintain the same relative position along the pavement, suggesting a deliberate trajectory that does not conform to ordinary pedestrian behaviour. Attempts to photograph the walker often result in empty frames or blurred images, further reinforcing the idea that the phenomenon exists in a space partially beyond normal perception. Fatigue and solitude influence many who travel the Highland Road, yet multiple independent witnesses confirm the figure's consistent form and behaviour. Drivers describe long stretches without seeing another vehicle, yet the walker appears at roughly the same locations, walking steadily without pause. Some hikers report that they pause to rest after climbing small ridges, only to see the figure emerge along the path below, unperturbed by the observer's presence or attempts to move closer. Guides familiar with the Highlands have recounted similar accounts, acknowledging that the road occasionally hosts the walker in ways that cannot be explained by fatigue, mirages, or misidentification of other travellers. Certain bends and open stretches appear consistently in reports of the figure, suggesting a peculiar pattern amid the otherwise random sightings. One of the most commonly noted locations is a long curve bordered by lava outcrops and glacial runoff, where several independent observers over the years have reported the walker appearing at nearly identical points. The repetition of these sightings, despite the long intervals between encounters, suggests that the figure follows an invisible itinerary along the road. Even during daylight, the stretch retains a quiet solemnity, though the walker is seldom reported outside the fading hours of twilight or early night, further emphasizing the enigmatic timing of his appearances. Rationalizations suggesting reflections, distant travelers, or optical illusions fall short when compared to the immediacy and precise timing of the walker's appearances. Shadows cast by rock formations, the reflection of distant lights, or stray hikers moving along the route provide no satisfying explanation, particularly when multiple witnesses report the same vanishing sequence. Some have suggested the possibility of travellers using off-road vehicles or concealed pathways, yet the walker is often seen on stretches of the road inaccessible by vehicle, and his disappearance does not conform to any known escape route. Even professional investigators who have surveyed the area and monitored it with cameras acknowledge that the figure eludes conventional categorization, a presence that is tangible yet untouchable. Even when the road lies empty, the presence of the disappearing walker feels tangible, leaving a question that no journey can resolve. The Suduvík synchronized dreams. The fjord lay still beneath a sky that barely shifted between dark and darker, and in Suduvík even the wind seemed to hold its breath as villagers drifted to sleep. The town, perched on the northern edge of the Westfjords, is small and isolated, its wooden homes clustered along the shoreline where waves lap quietly against jagged rocks. Nights in the region are long, particularly in winter, and the darkness can feel absolute, pressing against windows and doors. It was during these nights, over a span of several weeks, that residents began noticing an unusual pattern, waking with memories of dreams that seemed almost identical to those of others, despite living in separate households. The phenomenon was subtle at first, easily dismissed as a coincidence, yet, as reports accumulated, it became impossible to ignore, a silent thread weaving through the sleep of an entire village. At dawn, subtle murmurs spread through the streets as neighbours described dreams that overlapped in detail with uncanny precision. A fisherman spoke of navigating a narrow fjord in a small boat, while a shopkeeper recounted walking the same waters under the glow of a pale moon. Children described climbing cliffs that no one could identify, and yet the contours matched between accounts as though drawn from a shared map in the subconscious. Even casual conversations in the local bakery carried fragments of imagery repeated by several people, small coincidences that accumulated into an eerie pattern, challenging the villagers' understanding of their own nightly rest. Maps of the town's houses revealed an invisible thread, connecting windows and doorways that had appeared in the visions of multiple sleepers. Certain streets, particularly those bordering the harbour and the low hills inland, emerged repeatedly in dream descriptions, often with subtle variations, like a distorted mirror of reality. Locals began to keep informal journals sketching shapes, paths, and coastal features, hoping to detect any geographic correlation. In some cases, these features were recognisable in the real landscape. In others, they appeared entirely imagined, yet reported consistently across households. The sense of connectivity became almost palpable, as if the town itself had become a stage for visions that no single mind had authored. Some visitors came with notebooks and instruments, while others carried old Icelandic folk tales that spoke of shared visions warning of storms or sorrow. Psychologists noted that collective dreaming is rare but documented, often tied to intense social or environmental conditions, yet no established framework explained the precision or repeated imagery in Suduvík. Geologists and meteorologists suggested minor tectonic tremors or shifts in atmospheric pressure might influence sleep patterns, while folklorists recalled stories of same-sleep nights, when multiple villagers would dream of a common threat or apparition. None of these explanations fully accounted for the uncanny timing or detail, leaving the mystery suspended between the scientific and the mythical. The longest nights of the year seemed to stretch the dreams further, folding memory and imagination into shapes that no single person could claim. Observers noticed that the phenomenon intensified during the dark months, when the sun barely rises above the horizon and when the fjord's reflection was sharpest against the snow and ice. Tidal rhythms and the patterns of northern winds were carefully noted, yet no linear correlation could be confirmed. Still, the repetition was undeniable. Families across the village would awaken with recollections of climbing the same cliffs, walking along the same streets, or watching identical storms rage across the same imaginary waters, leaving a lingering sense that these experiences were rooted somewhere beyond ordinary perception. In a small wooden home by the edge of the harbour, a young girl traced the shapes of cliffs she had never seen with a trembling hand. Her brother described the same jagged rocks, though he had been asleep in the next room, and their parents realised that what had seemed fanciful moments before now demanded attention. Other individuals kept sketches of skies and coastlines, night after night, the pages slowly filling with uncanny symmetry. The experience was neither universally frightening nor entirely comforting. It created an undercurrent of shared unease, a quiet fascination that made the villagers wonder whether they were witnesses to something natural, supernatural, or simply beyond understanding. Though data was recorded diligently, charts and journals could not capture the quiet certainty that something unseen had been present in every household. A handful of journalists documented the events during brief visits, interviewing residents and reviewing sketches, yet their accounts conveyed more questions than answers. Medical examinations, sleep studies, and cognitive assessments revealed nothing abnormal, while small inconsistencies in recall further deepened the puzzle. Each attempt at rationalization highlighted the limits of observation, underscoring that the phenomenon persisted regardless of evidence, quietly reminding everyone involved that some patterns might exist outside conventional measurement. Even after the sun returned and the snow softened to slush, the echoes of the night remained, stitched into the rhythms of daily life. People noticed a new attentiveness to one another, a sense of unspoken connection threaded through conversations, glances, and shared memories of what had passed in darkness. The town maintained its routines. Boats launched from the harbour, children walked to school, and the wind carved its familiar paths. But the shadow of the synchronized dreams lingered, subtle yet persistent. Residents spoke less about coincidence and more about wonder, though a cautious unease remained, as if the fjord itself had become a repository for something collective, mysterious, and profoundly intimate. Between the fjord's mirrored surface and the shadows of a sleeping mind, Suduvík kept secrets that no one had yet dared to name. The Neskaupstadur Black Fog. The harbour town of Neskaupstadur is often veiled in shifting mists. but one evening in early winter, a black fog descended with an uncanny stillness that drew the gaze of every resident. Streets that normally reflected the pale glow of street lamps were swallowed in darkness so absolute it seemed to absorb the faint echoes of conversation and the distant slap of waves against the harbour. The fog moved without wind, pooling around corners and lingering over alleyways, and by the time anyone realised it was different from the usual winter haze, its presence had already cast an unspoken apprehension over the town. Reports later described it as a living shadow, a dense and soupy darkness that resisted dispersal even as temperatures and wind shifted, leaving locals unsettled and uncertain how to interpret its sudden arrival. Those who stepped outside spoke of a heaviness in the air, a dampness that clung to skin and clothing, giving the impression that the fog itself weighed down the body. Fishermen returning from the fjord spoke of a dense curtain that seemed to absorb light, muffling the usual creak of rigging and the distant cries of seabirds. Some swore that the fog appeared thicker over the water, curling around the masts of vessels like a slow-moving black tide. Yet it would retreat when they tried to approach, as if aware of human observation. Windows glimmered with the reflection of lanterns, but the glass seemed to betray no hint of the world outside. The fog created its own reality, one that felt detached from the natural order. Even seasoned sailors, accustomed to sudden mists rolling in from the sea, described a sensation of vertigo, as if the horizon itself had been erased. Each night brought fresh reports, each slightly different, yet all agreed that this was unlike anything the fjord had ever produced. Dogs refused to leave the hearth, and even the hardiest horses hesitated at the edges of the streets, as if the fog carried an unseen weight pressing against their instincts. Cats vanished for hours, reappearing with fur dampened and eyes wide, their usual territorial confidence replaced by wariness that unsettled even the most accustomed inhabitants. Birds would take flight in chaotic flocks, only to vanish into the blackness and return minutes later to the same rooftops without explanation. Children, usually fearless in winter's darkness, clung to doorframes, speaking of shapes moving beyond vision. The effect was not violent, but the consistency with which wildlife responded, each creature pausing, recoiling or retreating, suggested an intelligence or force within the fog that defied simple weather patterns. Archival weather notes from the 1940s mention occasional so-called dark drifts, but none describe the blackness lingering with the deliberateness reported in Neskaupstæður. The local newspaper of 1943 referred to a nightfall that refuses morning, though the description was brief and largely dismissed as atmospheric exaggeration. Meteorological records indicate that East Iceland can experience dense sea fogs, yet these typically dissipate as tides or winds shift. The black fog of this incident differed, remaining dense even under clear skies and high pressure, suggesting that historical patterns offered little guidance in understanding what had descended upon the town. Even scientists examining these records noted that while occasional fog anomalies were documented, none exhibited the same apparent agency or selective adherence to streets and buildings. Meteorologists who arrived to take readings could measure particulate matter and humidity, yet none could account for the fog's sudden density or its tendency to cling to streets rather than dissipate. Instruments showed ordinary moisture levels, but the visual impact was extreme, and attempts to recreate similar conditions in controlled experiments failed. The fog's behaviour contradicted known physics in subtle ways, drifting against prevailing winds, lingering in open squares, and thinning unpredictably over certain surfaces while thickening in others. Residents who recorded their own observations noted the unusual layering of the fog, where one section could appear nearly transparent and the adjacent street wholly opaque, further defying explanation. Each observation added to the sense that the phenomenon existed according to rules humans had yet to comprehend. Older residents spoke in hushed tones of the natmork, a local term for shadows that slip over the earth, warning children to stay indoors until they pass. Tales of dark clouds rolling over fjords and disappearing without explanation had been passed down for generations, though always framed as cautionary rather than investigative. These stories did not offer solutions, but they lent a cultural texture to the fog's intrusion, framing it as part of a continuum of unexplained occurrences rather than a singular anomaly. Even those skeptical of superstition could not dismiss the uneasy parallels between lived experience and legend. Some claimed that the fog seemed to avoid certain buildings, almost as if it were respecting boundaries, reinforcing the sense of an unseen consciousness at play. By the third night, the fog appeared to pulse along the fjord, drifting in narrow fingers that reached into homes and curling around lampposts, leaving a residue of cold unease long after it receded. Each pulse seemed to have a rhythm, a slow inhalation and exhalation of shadow, and those who observed it reported a subtle disorientation, as though the world itself had slightly shifted out of alignment. Small townsfolk gatherings were punctuated by silence, not just from awe but from a shared inexplicable fear, a recognition that something unseen had threaded itself into the fabric of the familiar. Even familiar objects appeared alien in its presence, with walls, furniture and cobblestones flattened into shadows and contours that refused normal perception. Whispers circulated of fleeting figures glimpsed through the black, yet no one could agree on what had been seen, leaving only the sensation of being watched. When the black fog lifted at dawn, it left behind no footprints, no scent, and a silence that seemed determined to linger indefinitely. The silent strike at Akranes lighthouse. Rising sharply from jagged cliffs, Akranes lighthouse casts its beam across restless seas, a familiar guide whose presence has long been intertwined with the rhythms of the coast. Its white walls, streaked with salt and wind, have stood for over a century, offering sailors a steadfast point of reference against unpredictable currents and sudden fogs. Generations of keepers have walked its spiral staircases, tending lamps, maintaining lenses, and recording weather with meticulous care. The structure has endured countless storms, snow-laden winters, and relentless Atlantic gales, its light cutting through darkness with unwavering precision. Yet on one night in recent history, the lighthouse's enduring constancy was fractured, not by storm or tide, but by an event so sudden and silent that it left every observer questioning the limits of what could occur in a place so carefully monitored, shaking faith in the very reliability of its guiding light. One night, without storm, tremor, or human warning, a sudden strike shattered the main lamp, freezing its mechanisms and leaving the tower cloaked in an unnatural hush. The beam, normally a bright arc cutting across waves, fell dark, leaving the coast and harbour in an unbroken shadow. Those in the nearby town of Akranes reported hearing nothing unusual. No crash, no vibration, no gust of wind. But the lighthouse itself seemed altered, its usual hum of machinery stilled as if holding its breath. The strike was precise. It damaged only the lamp, leaving surrounding instruments and the structure itself untouched, heightening the sense that this was no ordinary accident. Residents recalled that the air seemed heavier that night, carrying the scent of salt and cold stone, but also something intangible, a quiet tension that lingered long after the incident. At dawn, the lighthouse keeper noted that every gauge and switch remained in perfect order, yet the glass and metal of the lamp lay broken, an enigma without precedent. He recalled walking the spiral stairs just hours earlier, finding everything functioning normally, and now facing the inexplicable aftermath. Radio communications, essential for maritime safety, transmitted nothing beyond routine signals, and no nearby vessels reported collision or impact. The keeper's logs captured his confusion, the words careful and precise, noting anomalies that would later fuel questions rather than answers, as no environmental or mechanical explanation seemed adequate. Even the smallest details, the way the shadows in the lantern room fell differently, or the faint echo of broken glass, added to the sense of uncanny disruption. Fractured shards glimmered on the stone floor, scattering sunlight in irregular patterns, while not a single footprint or mark appeared anywhere in the compound to explain the damage. Dust, salt, and faint residue from the broken lamp were all that remained, yet they offered no clue to a cause. Even the cat that frequented the tower had vanished overnight, returning later with fur damp and eyes wide, behaving as though it had witnessed something beyond comprehension. Visitors noted that the air felt unusually cold and still inside the tower, a tangible silence that contrasted sharply with the usual creaks and groans of the old structure. The quiet precision of the strike and the absence of disturbance elsewhere suggested a force operating outside ordinary understanding, a disruption both surgical and elusive. Logs from the lighthouse's century-long operation recount storms and mechanical failures, but none describe a quiet, targeted disruption striking with such precise, silent force. Records mention lightning damage, gust-driven breakage, and occasional equipment failure, all accompanied by sound or vibration. None, however, matches the stillness and specificity of this strike, which seemed to target only the lamp itself. Mariners' accounts in the 20th century occasionally describe unusual reflections or fleeting shadows along the cliffs, yet the event at Akranes remains distinct, standing alone in the lighthouse's otherwise well-documented history. Even the local historical society struggled to find precedent, highlighting how anomalies in maritime infrastructure are rare and usually well documented, further emphasizing the strangeness of this strike. Technicians examined wiring, bearings, and surrounding rock faces, running every test possible, yet each result confirmed only that the tower and its mechanisms were undisturbed by conventional causes. No fracture patterns suggested pressure or weight beyond normal structural strain. Sensors showed no spike in energy, and even magnetic readings registered within normal ranges. Investigators considered the possibility of airborne debris or a bird strike, yet the precision of the damage and absence of any trace evidence eliminated such explanations. Some speculated on rare seismic vibrations or sudden shifts in air pressure, but instruments detected nothing to support these theories. The incident became a puzzle of physics and perception, with every rational avenue explored leading only to silence and continued uncertainty, leaving even the most skeptical experts unsettled. Following the repairs, faint metallic hums, subtle night vibrations, and fleeting shadows were reported along the cliffs, seemingly echoing the strike itself. Passers-by spoke of standing near the lighthouse at night and sensing an imperceptible rhythm beneath the floorboards, a vibration that coincided with the memory of the strike. Some fishermen claimed their instruments momentarily faltered when passing near the cliffs, registering brief, unexplained electrical interference. The unease was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet persistent, a reminder that the event, while repaired, had left its mark on the environment itself, like a scar impossible to see but impossible to ignore. Even distant lights across the fjord seemed oddly dimmed, as if the strike had extended its influence beyond the tower itself. Though the lighthouse now stands intact, its beam unwavering once more, an invisible tremor lingers in its walls, carrying a secret no one has yet been able to name. The frozen imprints of Vatnajökull. Under the pale light of winter, Vatnajökull sprawls endlessly, its icy surface fractured and gleaming, hiding mysteries in every crevasse and ridge. The glacier dominates the landscape, a frozen sea of white stretching toward distant peaks, absorbing sound and light alike. Layers of ice, some thousands of years old, shift imperceptibly, groaning and cracking with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Even the most seasoned explorers find themselves dwarfed, the cold pressing not just on the skin but on perception itself, as if the glacier itself imposes a quiet authority. It was here, along its northern edge, that a series of frozen imprints was discovered, depressions so precise and regular that they seemed to resist the natural chaos of ice and snow, hinting at a presence or force that had left its mark deliberately and without explanation. Along the glacier's northern reaches, explorers stumbled upon depressions in the ice, their precision unlike anything carved by wind, meltwater, or natural glacial movement. Each hollow measured several meters across, with edges so sharply defined that snow refused to drift into them as it did elsewhere. Some appeared arranged in linear patterns, others clustered in formations reminiscent of symbols, though none corresponded to any known system of mapping or measurement. No footprints, drag marks, or signs of wildlife accompanied the depressions, leaving observers baffled at how such shapes could exist in a landscape dominated by slow, relentless movement of ice. Sunlight striking the hollows revealed an unusual polish, a crystalline reflection that made the depressions seem almost deliberate, as if the glacier had recorded some message or event for reasons unknown. A biting silence enveloped the area, broken only by the faint crunch of boots on brittle ice and the cold metallic scent carried on the wind. Even distant avalanches or shifting seracs felt muted, absorbed into the glacier's vast expanse. Observers noted a peculiar stillness, as though time itself had slowed in the vicinity of the imprints. At certain angles, faint lines and grooves became visible within the hollows, catching sunlight in ways that made them appear temporarily etched with symbols before vanishing with the shifting rays. The effect was subtle but disorienting, and each step through the area seemed to heighten awareness of the glacier's immensity and the strange precision of its frozen markings. Examining decades of aerial surveys, expedition logs, and satellite images, glaciologists found no precedent for such formations, leaving the imprints as anomalies without explanation. Maps and photographs dating back to the early 20th century depicted crevasses, moulins, and ice ridges, yet none resembled the sharp, symmetrical depressions now visible. Even experienced researchers admitted that the geometry and location of the imprints defied ordinary processes of glacial formation and erosion. Local records noted unusual seasonal patterns and brief sightings of strange ice phenomena over the decades, but none matched the scale or clarity of the depressions, further emphasizing their singularity in the glacier's long history. Instruments designed to gauge ice density, pressure, and thermal variation detected nothing out of the ordinary, yet the marks persisted, contradicting conventional understanding. Thermal cameras, radar scans, and probes measured ice thickness, density, and temperature gradients, revealing normal readings throughout. Attempts to replicate the depressions artificially failed. The hollowed ice retained a sharpness and symmetry that melted or crumbled when created through conventional means. Every theory, wind pressure, sublimation, seismic microshifts, or even the impact of glacial meltwater, fell short, leaving scientists with a phenomenon both observable and inexplicable, a tangible record of some force or event that had left its imprint without explanation. Snowfall drifted unevenly across the hollows, lingering longer than on the surrounding ice, and forming miniature patterns that suggested an invisible influence guiding their preservation. Frost accumulated along the rims in delicate filigree, and tiny ice ridges appeared within the depressions, as if responding to an unseen template. Seasonal melt barely altered the hollows, and even the intense summer sun failed to erase their sharp contours. Observers began to perceive a subtle rhythm to the glacier's treatment of the depressions, a consistency that hinted at processes beyond ordinary glaciology, and the possibility that the ice itself was preserving memory, form, or intent. Even veteran guides hesitated near the depressions, noting an odd sense of stillness that seemed to stretch across the frozen terrain. Footsteps sounded muted, distances distorted, and the hollowed ice appeared to absorb movement in a way that unsettled perception. Some guides reported fleeting glimmers within the depressions, reflections that suggested shapes moving just beyond vision, though none could confirm the source. The psychological weight of the area was palpable. Those who approached felt a mixture of awe and unease, recognizing the glacier as a landscape that could hold secrets far older and more deliberate than human observation allowed. The glacier's surface held frozen impressions at twilight, stark and deliberate, as if inscribed with a message never intended for human understanding. The sudden winds of Kirkjubæjarklaustur. A grey light spread across the plains of Kirkjubæjarklaustur, and then, without prelude, air surged violently over lava fields and frozen riverbeds, bending the landscape with invisible force. The sudden gusts carved through the broad, open terrain with a precision that seemed at odds with the chaotic unpredictability of Icelandic weather. Rocks and scattered debris shifted, leaves whirled in tight eddies, and the sound of rushing air seemed amplified against the volcanic ridges, creating a resonance that unsettled the senses. Though the winds lasted only moments at a time, their abruptness left an impression that lingered, as if the land itself had been struck by some unseen hand, marking the area in a way observers could not yet interpret. Even the distant cliffs seemed to shiver, their volcanic surfaces echoing the invisible force moving across the plains. Fences quivered, and small rocks skittered across the ground as gusts arrived in abrupt, unpredictable bursts, leaving travellers scrambling for footing and belongings alike. Horses and livestock instinctively huddled, ears pinned, as the currents tore through pens and open pastures. Even seasoned guides, familiar with the shifting Icelandic winds, paused in astonishment, noting the uncharacteristic intensity and irregularity. There was no gradual build-up, no distant howl heralding their arrival, only sudden motion that transformed stillness into chaos in a matter of seconds, challenging conventional understanding of local meteorological behaviour. The ground, once quiet, seemed momentarily alive, rattling beneath boots and hooves in a way that human perception struggled to reconcile with the serene sky above. The wind carried a metallic crispness, whistling sharply through narrow valleys and hollow channels, producing a sound that unsettled both animals and humans within earshot. Gravel and volcanic ash lifted briefly, creating shimmering curtains of particulate that sparkled in the diffused sunlight. A faint vibration could be felt in the feet, as if the gusts carried a force that penetrated the ground itself. Every object they encountered, from benches to farm tools, was pushed and tossed, yet some items seemed inexplicably untouched, as though the currents favoured certain paths or followed hidden contours beneath the surface of the plains. In rare moments, the gusts formed twisting funnels of snow or dust that lasted only seconds, hinting at underlying structures within the air itself. Meteorological accounts from the surrounding region reference fleeting intense gusts, yet climatologists struggle to reconcile these events with known Icelandic wind patterns or documented phenomena. Katabatic and foehn winds are familiar in other parts of the country, yet these bursts occurred without the usual atmospheric precursors. Measurements of air pressure, temperature and humidity failed to predict or explain the sudden onset. Even in decades of archived data, few comparable incidents appear, making Kirkjubæjarklaustur a locus of curiosity for both local historians and weather scientists alike, who have often documented the peculiarity in logs but offered no definitive explanation. Some older diaries recount similar gusts during the early 20th century, described as breaths of the mountains, yet even these accounts lacked consistency in timing or intensity, adding layers of mystery to a phenomenon that persists today. Shepherds and hikers alike described a disorienting sense of turbulence, where gusts lifted dust, leaves, and light objects in patterns that suggested intention rather than chance. Children playing near the river bends froze as the air momentarily became violent and capricious, then receded just as suddenly. Locals spoke of the phenomena in hushed tones, using descriptors that mixed awe and apprehension, noting the uncanny way the winds would sometimes return to the same locations, tracing invisible routes across the landscape as though following an unknown plan. Scientists accompanying hikers recorded minute variations in wind speed and direction, yet these metrics offered no clear predictive pattern, reinforcing the sense that the gusts operated beyond conventional understanding. Measurements from velocity sensors and barometric instruments captured sudden spikes that could not be forecasted, illustrating the unpredictability and unique character of the burst that swept through the region. High-resolution anemometers detected fleeting gusts exceeding expectations for the given atmospheric conditions, yet failed to record consistent direction or duration. Researchers attempted to map the paths of the winds, but the data was erratic, offering glimpses of patterns without explanation. Every spike was followed by silence, creating a rhythm that was both mesmerizing and frustrating, as if the winds themselves were aware of the human effort to observe them. Computer models approximated airflow over the terrain, but repeatedly failed to reproduce the abrupt, transient strength that witnesses experienced firsthand. Careful attention revealed subtle interactions between the gusts and the terrain, ridges channeling the airflow, lava cracks funneling currents, and low plains amplifying velocity in strange and inconsistent ways. The wind sometimes accelerated across open stretches and then decelerated over minor depressions, producing sudden flurries of dust and small stones. Even microtopography appeared to influence movement, yet the force retained an unpredictability that defied modelling. Some scientists speculated about thermal differentials, but the abruptness and repetition of the gusts suggested a process that could not be fully captured by conventional meteorology. The landscape seemed to act as both canvas and conduit, shaping and yet remaining at the mercy of these bursts, each passage leaving invisible signatures on the air itself. Though the gusts had vanished, the plains retained an uncanny rhythm, as if the wind itself had etched a pattern that only the land could comprehend. The white figure of Snæfellsjökull. A biting wind swept across the upper ridges of Snæfellsjökull, lifting snow in thin sheets that shimmered in the pale sunlight. The glacier's slopes, streaked with jagged crevasses and dark volcanic rock, stretched wide and silent, yet the sudden play of light and shadow could suggest movement where none existed. Beneath this shifting glow, travellers sometimes glimpsed a form of impossible whiteness moving along the slopes, its presence as fleeting as it was mysterious. Even experienced guides paused, unsure whether what they had seen was a trick of the ice or something beyond ordinary explanation. The air carried a faint scent of ozone, as if the glacier itself were reacting to the sudden stirring, amplifying the sensation that something unusual lingered in these remote heights. Climbers ascending the northern ridges recalled a sudden sense of being watched, a presence that seemed to track their progress without warning. The figure's movements were slow and deliberate, almost gliding over the snow, leaving observers uncertain whether it was corporeal or merely a distortion of light and shadow. Some hikers attempted to follow it, only to find the shape dissolved into the glacier's pale expanse as if it had never existed. Yet the collective memory of the sighting persisted, growing in detail with each retelling, an enigmatic constant in the harsh and silent terrain. In the thin air, hearts raced not just from exertion, but from the unnerving sense that the glacier itself might be observing the climbers in return. Reflections fractured on the icy surface, bouncing sunlight across jagged ridges and deep crevasses, producing illusions that made the figure both visible and impossible to approach. Snowdrifts shifted with the wind, creating ephemeral corridors of light that sometimes aligned with the glimpsed movements, enhancing the impression that the figure navigated with intent. Observers noted that the apparition often seemed to pause at high points, where the eye expected nothing, before vanishing behind ridges or folds in the glacier, as though it respected some invisible geography. The quiet was interrupted only by the occasional snap of ice underfoot or the soft whistle of wind funneling through crevices, giving the impression that the glacier itself had a heartbeat. Explorers' journals from the early 20th century occasionally describe fleeting figures on Snæfellsjökull's upper reaches, though the records emphasize uncertainty and caution, leaving only fragments of observation. One account mentions a white silhouette visible only for a few seconds near a cliff's edge, vanishing before it could be closely examined. Folklore hints at ethereal guardians or spirits of the glacier, yet the historical mentions remain factual in content, never sensationalized, and consistently describe brief, inexplicable sightings rather than narratives or encounters. These layers of historical record create a subtle resonance, suggesting that the phenomenon has persisted across generations, always at the edge of perception, silently threading itself into the memory of those who dared the glacier's heights. Observers froze in place when the figure appeared, straining binoculars or merely staring, aware that it moved with deliberate elusiveness. Some felt a chilling awareness that their own movements were being mirrored or anticipated, an effect difficult to describe in conventional terms. Even when the figure disappeared, it left a lingering impression on those present, a sense that the glacier retained memory of its passage. Emotional responses ranged from awe to unease, yet no witness doubted that something had crossed the boundary between the visible and the unexplainable in that instant. Many described an intangible weight, a sensation of quiet pressure pressing on perception itself, as if reality had momentarily shifted in response to the figure. Light, ice and shadow combined in ways that could fool perception, yet careful measurement and repeated observation confirmed that the phenomena could not be reduced entirely to optical effects. Scientists studying the glacier documented the interplay of reflection, refraction, and sun angle, yet even under controlled observation, the shape continued to appear, defying predictable patterns. Instruments recorded no corresponding physical object, no disturbance of snow or ice, reinforcing the impression that the figure was neither wholly external nor entirely imaginary. It existed in a liminal space, at once tangible and elusive, occupying a threshold between what could be measured and what could only be intuited. The figure often appeared near subtle shifts in terrain where sunlight met snow, re-emerging in similar locations across weeks and months, suggesting a pattern that defied casual explanation. Some observers noted that these appearances coincided with sudden changes in wind direction or glinting snow patches, yet the precise alignment remained inconsistent. Efforts to map sightings across the glacier revealed faint correlations, but no definitive path, leaving scientists, guides, and hikers alike with more questions than answers. The repetition and unpredictability created an uneasy rhythm, a pattern that implied intention without revealing purpose. Even seasoned guides admitted that tracking the apparition required patience and an awareness that perception itself could be unreliable. At times, the glacier seemed to hold its breath. The stillness between gusts of wind created pockets of silence in which the figure might appear and disappear entirely, as though the mountain had designed its own intervals of revelation. Snow sparkled under low sunlight, glittering like scattered fragments of crystal, and the figure seemed to exploit these conditions, becoming visible only in fleeting alignment with natural light and shadow. Those who witnessed it described a momentary dissonance, the sensation that the white form was simultaneously part of the glacier and yet distinctly other, resisting categorization by any known phenomenon. Long after the last sighting faded from memory, the white form seemed to linger at the edge of vision, a silent presence that refused to be captured or fully understood. The Fljótsdalur River Coil. Sunlight fractured against the river's winding surface, scattering across shallow ripples and revealing subtle eddies that seemed almost deliberate before any observer could name their source. The water threaded through the valley in a series of gentle curves, bordered by reeds and steep banks streaked with moss, yet the eye could not ignore the occasional anomaly, a coil of water spinning silently, too regular to be mere coincidence. Travellers passing along the banks reported the sensation of the river holding its own rhythm, an invisible pulse beneath the surface that suggested more than natural flow. Occasionally the coils appeared near bends where the current slowed, vanishing as if the river itself had erased the trace of its fleeting activity. Fishermen casting lines along narrow stretches often spoke of circular ripples, forming without wind, stone or sudden movement, their rotations precise yet ephemeral. Some described pausing mid-cast, watching the water rotate in perfect whirls, then dissolve into flat glass, leaving no indication of what had caused the motion. Guides who led seasonal excursions noted the repetition of these occurrences, though no two were exactly alike, creating the impression that the river had its own unseen logic. Even for those accustomed to Iceland's unpredictable waterways, the coils carried an inexplicable weight, as though the river were subtly asserting its presence along stretches where the current slowed, sediment and water twisted into shapes that seemed intentional, defying ordinary patterns and hinting at forces unseen beneath the surface. Light refracted along shallow pools, creating glints that danced like fleeting spectres, making the coil appear and vanish in the same instant. Observers noted the phenomenon often recurred near small depressions and bends, areas where water movement could be expected but not to this exacting, spiralling degree. The interplay of shadow, reflection, and the gentle hum of flowing water heightened the sense that the river itself had become a living entity, capable of deliberate concealment. Early surveys of the valley occasionally mention unusual water behaviour, with scribbled notes recording coils, whirls, and sudden twists that left no mark once observed. Though brief, these accounts persisted across decades, from explorers' journals to local historians' records, consistently describing fleeting shapes that vanished without evidence. Folklore hints at water spirits inhabiting Icelandic rivers, yet the accounts from Fljótsdalur focus on physical observation rather than myth, offering fragments of mystery rooted in nature's tangible but confounding behaviour. The repetition across time lent the river a quiet notoriety, a subtle reputation that warned visitors to watch carefully and expect the unexpected. Locals often paused at the banks, waiting for hours to track the movement, measuring flow and depth, only to witness the phenomenon shift as if aware of their attention. Some fishermen attempted to cast nets into the centre of the coils, hoping to capture the irregularity physically, but the water seemed to respond to the intrusion, unravelling the spiral before it could be contained. Children in nearby farms spoke of tossing stones and seeing the water ripple in ways that did not match the size or timing of their throw. The sensation of the river reacting, subtly but unmistakably, created a quiet unease, as if it existed just beyond comprehension. Hydrologists studied the unusual currents, calculating sediment displacement, flow velocity, and wind influence. Yet even precise measurements failed to fully explain the repeated circular formations. Instruments recorded no extraordinary pressure or hidden obstacles beneath the surface, leaving a gap between observation and explanation. Researchers noted that while typical eddies occur naturally in bends or pools, the coils of Fljótsdalur maintained a regular, almost geometric consistency that defied standard fluid dynamics. The combination of measured data and eyewitness accounts suggested that the river's behaviour could not be dismissed, yet no theory could fully account for the visible phenomena. The coil's appearances were most frequent near sudden bends or shallow pools, occurring with enough regularity to suggest a pattern, though its purpose or origin remained entirely elusive. Some observers noted subtle alignment with sunlight reflecting off the surrounding cliffs, but this could not account for occurrences during overcast days. Attempts to map the phenomenon revealed faint correlations, but each coil was subtly different, maintaining a sense of unpredictability even within a repeating framework. This balance of order and mystery reinforced the river's enigmatic presence, a reminder that nature can produce patterns both mesmerizing and incomprehensible. Shadows of reeds stretched across the water's surface, glinting alongside the coil as if the river itself were aware of being watched, heightening the sense of quiet expectancy in the valley. Birds lifted abruptly from the banks, startled by no apparent cause, while distant rock faces reflected light at angles that intensified the water's shimmering spirals. The air carried the faint scent of wet earth and riverine vegetation, grounding the observer even as their attention was drawn to phenomena that refused categorization. Each glance offered the possibility of revelation, yet delivered only subtle changes, a rhythm that suggested vigilance and patience were required to witness the river's secrets. Once the river settled, the swirling coils remained in memory, leaving a sense that something unseen continued to move beneath the surface, waiting for the next observer. The Þjórsárvöllur cabin distortion. Fog clung to the river channels snaking through Þjórsárvöllur, and amid the muted expanse, a modest wooden cabin seemed almost misplaced, its geometry resisting casual comprehension. The valley, shaped by centuries of volcanic activity and river erosion, carried the quiet weight of isolation, yet this structure, built with ordinary materials and simple lines, evoked a subtle dissonance in anyone who approached. Local guides noted that the cabin's presence was unremarkable at first glance, yet lingering near its threshold brought an ineffable sense that something was slightly off in the way the building occupied space. Initial accounts did not leap to the extraordinary. The anomaly rested in perception, in the way the eye and mind failed to reconcile measurements with what was seen. Angles that should have aligned perfectly instead conflicted, with doorframes subtly wider on one side than the other, as if the building itself were negotiating an unseen distortion. The floorboards, though straight and well-maintained, seemed to stretch longer under certain vantage points, and furniture corners occasionally appeared to drift outward, creating an unintentional asymmetry. Even small ordinary objects, the iron latch on a window, the hinges on the door, invited strange tension, as if gravity had decided to favour one side over the other. Those tasked with mapping the cabin repeatedly paused, adjusting tape measures and theodolites, only to find that every new reading contradicted the last, producing a disorienting loop of measurement that had no logical explanation. A persistent hum, barely audible, resonated from the ground near the cabin, and pebbles scattered across the threshold occasionally shifted without explanation. The surrounding air carried a metallic tang, subtle but distinct, and temperature gradients seemed unusually sharp for the open valley, dipping noticeably at the cabin's corners before returning to normal several steps away. Even the river nearby appeared to acknowledge the anomaly. Currents would swirl slightly differently when passing close to the cabin's shadow, though such minor variations were imperceptible to instruments. These environmental nuances did not produce overt phenomena, but they layered together, creating a sense that the cabin imposed a quiet influence on its immediate surroundings. The interior walls caught sunlight in ways that created patterns, refusing to remain consistent, bending across surfaces in ways that defied simple reflection. Beams that should have illuminated the room uniformly produced angles that shifted imperceptibly as visitors moved through the space. Shelves and tables, solid and anchored, sometimes seemed to tilt at a fraction of a degree beyond possibility, just enough to unsettle the eye. The ceiling beams, crafted from sturdy timber, occasionally appeared elongated when viewed from certain corners, giving the impression that the interior could not be fully contained by its measured dimensions. No single object seemed to act independently. The effect emerged from the totality of the cabin's interior, a cumulative, subtle distortion that frustrated exact analysis. Footsteps sounded oddly heavy or light depending on their path, and objects left in one corner often reappeared slightly askew after brief absences. Accounts from hikers and occasional photographers describe a disconcerting hesitation, a sense of timing that did not match perception, as if the cabin itself nudged awareness off kilter. Few were willing to assert anything overtly paranormal, but nearly all noted a persistent unease. the kind that arises not from fear but from the incongruence between expectation and observation. Visitors often commented that leaving the cabin felt like stepping back into a world with clearer, more predictable geometry, though the memory of its interior lingered unshakable in subtle ways. Maps dating from the 19th century indicate no irregularity in the cabin's location, yet nothing accounts for the subtle inconsistencies reported decades later. Historical surveys note the cabin as a typical dwelling of its era, with no extraordinary construction methods, and records confirm that the structure endured repeated inspections during settlement expansions and archaeological documentation. Yet despite the consistency of historical and structural evidence, the modern experience diverges sharply from expectation. The valley itself has changed little. Volcanic soil and meandering rivers continue their slow, deliberate shaping, but the cabin remains a locus of dissonance, resisting integration into both geography and memory. Laser scans produced overlapping lines and shadows that could not exist within conventional geometry, leaving experts with data that challenged expectations. Attempts to model the interior in 3D returned images that seemed plausible at first, only to reveal discrepancies when compared to human perception. Corners that appeared right-angled to an observer were slightly obtuse in the scans. Lengths that should have been uniform displayed subtle but consistent elongations. Even advanced techniques failed to resolve the anomaly, reinforcing the notion that the distortion was not merely physical but perceptual, existing at the intersection of measurement, light, and human observation. A faint chill lingered in the air around certain walls, and spatial relationships seemed to shift imperceptibly, so that visitors often felt off balance without understanding why. Returning multiple times amplified the sensation. Angles that appeared stable on one visit appeared subtly altered the next. Shadows refused to match earlier trajectories, and the eye registered a tension that the mind could not label. There was no outright danger, no violent interference, only the creeping sense that reality itself, within this modest cabin, adhered to rules slightly different from the valley outside. The sensation of being slightly out of step with reality clung long after departure, as if the cabin had left a trace that refused to fade. The seal circle of Ytri Tunga. Where the western shore of Ytri Tunga met the sea, waves tore at jagged rocks while low tide uncovered sandbars etched with patterns no human hand could replicate. Salt-laden winds swept across the flats, carrying the distant calls of seabirds and the occasional splash of water as a seal slipped between rocks. From a distance, the coastline appeared ordinary, rugged cliffs, scattered driftwood, and the ever-changing tide, but careful observers noted that certain areas drew the seals in formations that were both precise and enigmatic. Among these gatherings, one peculiar phenomenon had captured the attention of locals and visitors alike: the seal circle, a congregation of seals arrayed in near-perfect symmetry that appeared to emerge overnight, untouched by human interference yet seemingly purposeful in its arrangement. Grey and harbour seals lounged among the stones, their sleek forms moving with a rhythm honed by generations of survival along Iceland's coastlines. Scientists recognize these species as highly social, often forming loose groups for protection or mating, but the gatherings at Ytri Tunga stood out for their extraordinary order. The seals' bodies glistened under intermittent sunlight, their dark eyes reflecting the sky as they shifted subtly, adjusting spacing and posture in a way that hinted at coordination beyond casual chance. Observers noted that the largest males typically positioned themselves at intervals around the outer edge, while females and younger seals filled the inner circle, creating an arrangement that felt almost ceremonial in its balance and symmetry. Fishermen recount stepping onto the beach at dawn to find the seals arranged in a near-perfect circle, a formation unlike any they had witnessed before. One account described a man who, after years of daily work along these shores, paused mid-step, astonished at the geometric precision before him. The circle's diameter remained remarkably consistent, often spanning 15 to 20 metres, and it persisted for hours before dispersing as the tide rose. These repeated observations have been recorded over decades, yet no single explanation has satisfied both the naturalistic and the mysterious aspects of the pattern. Each morning the circle seemed to reassemble itself with an almost deliberate precision, as if invisible hands were guiding the placement of every animal. Researchers who returned to document the phenomenon over consecutive days found that the formation's orientation often aligned with the incoming tide, while the relative spacing of the seals remained consistent. Even in harsh weather, when fog hung low and gusts bent coastal grasses to the ground, the circle's structure endured, suggesting an internal logic or instinctive understanding among the seals that remains incompletely explained. The tide retreated in measured arcs, leaving pools that reflected the pale sunlight, casting the circle in a mirrored symmetry that confounded casual observation. The shallow water glimmered with fragments of broken shells and seaweed, creating natural mosaics that seemed to echo the seal's arrangement. Visitors noted that stepping too close often caused only partial dispersal, as if the group's cohesion was fragile yet surprisingly resilient, a paradox that heightened the sense of wonder surrounding the circle. Shadows elongated across the sand, transforming ordinary gatherings into scenes of quiet, almost ritualistic precision, where each element of the environment contributed to an uncanny harmony. Legends whisper of the Selkie, the seal folk who walk on land, and some locals cannot help but draw parallels between these tales and the strange gatherings they witness. Stories passed down through coastal families tell of seals that move with human-like intent, of circles that appear as markers or messages left upon the sand, and of fleeting glimpses of figures that vanish as quickly as they arrive. While no verifiable encounters confirm the presence of such beings, the narratives underscore a cultural lens through which the seal circle is observed, a blend of respect for natural phenomena and the ever-present pull of the inexplicable. Marine biologists note that while seals form groups for breeding or feeding, the consistency and scale of this circle defy known behavioural patterns, leaving a thread of mystery intact. Documented studies suggest that factors such as tidal cycles, lunar phases, and seasonal breeding can influence movement, yet these do not fully account for the repeated formation of precise circles at Ytri Tunga. Some researchers speculate that subtle social cues or acoustic signals may play a role, though these hypotheses remain untested in situ, leaving open the possibility that the seal's coordination emerges from instincts or environmental feedback not yet understood by science. On a misted evening, an observer recorded the circle shifting with subtle movements, the seals rising and sinking as though responding to a signal inaudible to human senses. The observer noted the almost imperceptible adjustments in posture, the spacing that appeared to contract and expand, and the way light refracted off wet fur, giving the formation an ethereal quality. Even without direct explanation, the sight conveyed a sense of order and intention, as if the landscape itself had a voice, spoken only through the living geometry of the seals who gathered upon it. On the retreating tide's path, the circle's memory persisted, a quiet question etched in sand that refused to fade with the setting sun. The midnight figure at Laugarvatn Woods. Moonlight filtered through the dense canopy of Laugarvatn Woods, painting the ground in fractured silver and shadow, where the slightest movement seemed to carry purpose beyond the ordinary. The night was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a night bird, yet the stillness was deceptive, as though the forest itself watched and waited. In this subtle tension, observers began to notice something peculiar, a humanoid figure that appeared briefly along shadowed paths, vanishing as quickly as it was glimpsed, leaving behind only an unsettling awareness that someone or something had been present. Though sightings were infrequent, the consistency of the figure's appearance over time had drawn the attention of both locals and visitors who walked the woods after dark. The underbrush whispered with subtle movement, a mixture of pine needles, moss, and fallen leaves creating a tapestry of sound that filled the otherwise silent night. Laugarvatn Woods, located near the lake of the same name, is known for its mixed birch and pine stands, interspersed with pockets of low shrubs and rocky outcrops that make navigation at night difficult. The terrain shifts quickly, with hidden hollows and sudden rises, creating an environment where shadows deepen and perspective can deceive. These natural features, ordinary by day, take on an eerie quality under moonlight, lending a quiet drama to every rustle and shifting silhouette. Hikers and residents of Laugarvatn recall noticing a figure gliding between trees, brief and untraceable, leaving only a lingering sense of presence in its wake. One account describes a family walking along a faint trail when a dark shape moved silently between the trunks, maintaining a consistent pace and distance before disappearing behind a stand of birches. Others report glimpses from the edges of the forest, where the figure seems aware of being watched, pausing just long enough to suggest intent without revealing any detail. These observations, documented in local records and anecdotal accounts, establish a pattern that remains unexplained. Each observation described the silhouette as unnervingly still at times, then shifting with deliberate grace, defying easy classification as human or animal. Witnesses often note the figure's proportions appear slightly off, with limbs that linger in the periphery of vision longer than expected, and a posture that seems both familiar and alien. Movements are deliberate yet fluid, suggesting consciousness and awareness, yet nothing concrete. No face, no distinguishing features ever emerges. The resulting ambiguity leaves observers unsettled, balancing on the edge between natural explanation and something beyond. Amid the low-lying mist, moonlight scattered into ever-changing forms, teasing perception and challenging the eye to tell reality from illusion. Low fog frequently gathers in the hollows of Laugarvatn woods, softening the outlines of rocks and trees and refracting the pale light. Even experienced hikers describe moments when the forest seems to warp subtly around the figure, enhancing its spectral presence. Shadows merge, separate, and move with a rhythm that does not always coincide with the figure's apparent steps, heightening the sense that the woods themselves participate in the enigma. Local lore speaks of night wanderers and unseen watchers in the woods, stories that intertwine with actual sightings and shape how the phenomenon is remembered. Tales of hidden spirits and solitary figures have been passed down for generations, often emphasizing lessons of respect for the forest and caution after dark. While these accounts are not verifiable, they provide context for the collective awareness surrounding Laugarvatn woods, where the figure's appearances are interpreted with a mixture of fear, reverence, and curiosity. The blending of folklore and observation magnifies the tension, even among those who approach the woods with rational expectations. While low-light conditions and peripheral vision quirks can mimic humanoid movement, researchers note this explains only some of the repeated reports. Night vision in humans is limited, and shadows can trick perception, producing the fleeting forms of branches or animals as figures in motion. However, the consistency of the sightings, time, location, and movement pattern suggest that these optical effects alone cannot explain the phenomenon. Scientists continue to study the interplay of perception, light, and environment in the woods, yet no definitive explanation has emerged. A single observer recounts stepping carefully through the damp undergrowth, feeling the figure's presence close, yet always remaining just beyond reach, as though the forest itself guided its motions. Leaves crackled underfoot, and the faint scent of moss and wet earth filled the air, grounding the experience in sensory reality while the figure remained intangible. At moments, a branch would shift, a shadow would lengthen, and the figure would reappear, provoking both fascination and unease. Even after the observer withdrew to the edge of the woods, the sense of deliberate attention lingered, a reminder that the figure existed in a space between reality and imagination. When the last light faded behind the tree line, the memory of that silent form lingered, a question that refused to be answered by dawn.